So we are delighted to be interviewing a British academic who is an acknowledged expert on the practice of religion, belief and values in the United Kingdom and modern societies. Linda Woodhead, MBE, is a distinguished professor of the Sociology of Religion in the Department of Politics, Philosophy and Religion at Lancaster University, and is probably best known for her work on religious change and the rise of new spiritualities since the 1980s, and for initiating public debates about faith and her trenchant views on the Church of England, which we'll get to. So welcome, Linda, and thank you for letting us interview you.
Thank you, Jason.
So as this is an interview in an oral history format, we spend quite a lot of time looking at the geography of home and family. So can I ask firstly, when and where you were born?
I was born in Taunton in Somerset.
Taunton in Somerset.
In a very rural part of the world.
Yes, I won't try and fake a Somerset accent.
I can do that for you.
You could do that, yeah. My wife, her father died just a few days ago. Her parents are Geordies and my grandparents were Geordies. When my wife spends time with her family, I don't understand a word she says for a couple of hours afterwards because she laps into all of her colloquialisms. So Taunton in Somerset, thank you. A lot of people won't know, listening to this, where that is. It's in the west of England. It was also probably infamously the site of the film Hot Fuzz, wasn't it, Somerset?
You know, I didn't know that, but you're right now I think about it. You are right. Yes, Somerset's the part you usually pass through on the way down to Cornwall.
Exactly, you're passing through it somewhere.
Passing through county, like Lancaster, where I live now, that's also the passing through county. So I come from the two most unfashionable parts of Britain, really.
Because I always think of Lancaster because it's when I was getting the train from Durham to London, I'm sure it goes past the cathedral, doesn't it?
I saw your university on the M6 as I passed by. It's got a notice on the motorway. So yeah, I live in and pass by places.
I have actually I've never been to Lancaster. I've only been, like you say, through on the M6.
So Americans always say Lancaster, and I say yes, it's like the Midwest of the USA, Lancashire. You wouldn't go there. You know, people in London go down to France, but they would never come to Lancashire.
Brilliant. Yeah, so the black comedy Hot Fuzz was filmed in Somerset, and it's interesting because it sort of tries to tap into the locality, as I understand it, a psychopathic neighbourhood watch society that kills anyone that disturbs the tranquility of the town. Does that fit Somerset from your recollections?
Of course not. But it is quite untroubled by other concerns of the world and Britain. Yes.
Yeah, brilliant. And of course, people will have heard of the Glastonbury Festival.
Glastonbury. So actually, I was born in Taunton, literally in the hospital, but I grew up in a more rural part even than Taunton, to the west, in a little village. And Glastonbury was nearby, and Glastonbury is a really important and interesting place. I grew up in a village that was very, very old-fashioned and very traditional and very rural, really. It was just a farming community. And Glastonbury was very exotic, of course, and opened your eyes to another interesting alternative world. Glastonbury was quite, that was exotic. You didn't go there very often. That was a...
Yeah, what was it like? Was there sort of a penumbra to it that you could, you said it was exotic, where there are people hanging around outside?
The festival was still quite young, and that was like the local festival, I suppose. So that brought a bit of the world to Somerset.
Yeah. I mean, your background very different to mine. So surrounded by countryside, I can't imagine what it's like growing up in the countryside. My wife did. I grew up on a council estate surrounded by concrete. I still to this day feel quite calmed if I wander around lots of concrete. It's interesting.
Oh, that's interesting. I feel the same in a field.
Yeah, it's your childhood, isn't it? I mean, my childhood memories are of concrete. so
cows.
Yeah, cows. Brilliant. So down in Somerset, fantastic. And I'm going to start with your family background a little, and we find in these interviews starting with grandparents is where we like to start. So could you tell us a little bit about your grandparents, what you remember about them? Any memories?
My mother's parents lived quite nearby, and I never knew my father's father, but I knew his mother who lived with us. She was from Yorkshire, and my grandparents were colonials. They'd been around the country, I mean around the world, I suppose, and they'd retired. He was in the army, and they'd retired to Taunton. Everyone came back to Somerset. Wherever they'd been, they came back to Somerset. And my parents grew up in Africa and had come back and never really found their feet. You know, people never found their feet who came back. So it's odd. It was odd. No one quite belonged anywhere. My father was an agricultural labourer, and I don't think he ever fitted in. You know, he didn't understand the people around him, and they didn't understand him. Strange, dislocated family.
So was Somerset a place that people tried to flee from, but then came back to, by the sounds of it?
I don't know why they chose Somerset. They chose it. I don't know why. I think it was just chance that he knew someone who'd offer him a job when he came back to England. Yeah. On the farm there.
Gosh, ended up there. So yeah, any memories with your grandparents that stand out for you that you might have when you were a child?
I remember my grandfather taking me to the officers' mess in the barracks.
Oh.
And it being a world of men. And, you know, a kind of hierarchy. They'd salute. You didn't know they were saluting somebody. You didn't know because that was somebody higher ranked. So it was all very, I mean, it was very struck me as, you know, it was really kind of exciting but alien world. And I thought it'd be great to be part of that. I loved that. Yeah. But then I got the brochure from and read it, and you couldn't as a woman in those days.
Oh, really?
No, you couldn't. I mean, you could only go to you were cut off at a certain rank. And you had to wear a horrible skirt. You couldn't wear the nice uniforms. I think it was the uniforms I liked. That was, you know, it was like a door being slammed in your face. I think that's the first time you realise.
Yeah.
I just can't do some of these things. It's not my fault. Why can't I do these things that are open to other people?
So how old were you when you that memory of going to the mess?
Oh, I don't know. Small. He must have been babysitting, and he just couldn't bear it and wanted to have a drink.
Yeah, so everything must have been huge. A different perspective, isn't it, when you're little, looking up at the world around you. So this alien world must have been very different than.
It was very different from the farm, you know, and the bright lights are all very different.
Fantastic. So peering into these other worlds, it's interesting. I find it absolutely fascinating. All the different subcultures everywhere.
Yeah, my world was very small. It was as far as I could cycle on my small bicycle, which was a few miles to the next village. But I knew every field, every hedge, every stream, I knew that. So it felt like a big world.
Yeah. Do you go back to Somerset at all?
Yes, because my mum's still alive and she's still down there.
Yeah, because I'm from Luton, and I find, like you said, I can go back to places that we walk into primary school and remember exactly where every lamppost is, as if it was yesterday. And there's a sort of intense familiarity with somewhere where you were a child. But then there's all these crenellation of things, or, you know, all the things that are written over the top of it. It feels quite strange, somewhere that's familiar but different. Has that happened to Somerset at all?
You come back. Do you remember did you watch or read the Ferrante novels, you know, about the Italian childhood?
No.
They've been really popular recently, particularly with women, because they depict, you know, two young girls growing up together,
right.
and in Naples, and one of them goes to university from a working class background, and then she finds that when she comes back, once she's graduated, she doesn't fit. And I hadn't thought about it before, but it does convey that, you know, once you've left and you come back, it's intensely familiar to you, and yet you don't fit because you've had a different experience from your friends who have stayed there. And I think it's a bit like that
Yeah, so just talking about it with you, I find it a disconcerting feeling that I can't put into words. It's familiar, but I like that. It doesn't fit anymore. Who you are doesn't translate with the changes as well.
Find a new relationship with it, I think.
Yeah. So Somerset. So where are we? I'm asking you about your grandparents. And then let's move on to your parents then. Parents can often be quite different temperamentally, it is a common adage. Was that true of your parents?
Different from me, you mean?
No, different to each other.
Oh, different from each other.
Or were they similar to each other?
They were pretty kind of, we'd say, codependent these days, probably.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
I think they were quite similar. I didn't mean they got on, but I think they were quite similar.
Yeah.
Quite bonded together.
Yeah. What was their relationship like that you remember in terms of temperament and the disposition with each other?
I think, I'm going back to another book that I just read, which is Motherwell, by Deborah Orr, the Guardian journalist who died recently, and that was about her upbringing in Motherwell. I actually I'm married to a Glaswegian, so I live in Glasgow partly, so I was interested in Motherwell. But it's a play on words, because it's about her mother as well as the place she grew up. It's a beautiful book. And she always thought her mother was a dominant one, but then when she writes the book and thinks about it, she realised actually it was her father who was the dominant one, and her mother was somehow, she appeared the dominant one, but he was the quiet main force in the household. And I thought, that's actually true of my parents. Everyone would have said that my mother was bossing him about, but really he was the one quietly pulling the strings. And that was definitely how it was.
It is interesting when you revisit your childhood memories as an adult and reinterpret them, don't you? I always thought my father was sleeping when I was younger, and of course realised later in life he was an alcoholic, so he was drunk most of the time.
Oh yeah, my father was.
He was a nice drunk. He was a nice drunk.
Yes, my father was also alcoholic, and quiet alcoholic.
Was he?
Yeah.
Yeah. Was that something you were aware of when you were younger?
Yeah. Absolutely, always. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, was that
pretty young because of it?
Yeah, without prying too much. I mean, my family were all hardworking coal miners and colliers, and I'm not surprised they drank to numb the pain of daily life. But smoking and drinking was a family tradition. But in terms of alcohol, was that a working class inheritance your father had, or any awareness you've got about him drinking?
It was never talked about. It still isn't really talked about. So I don't know what. I think it was the dislocation of coming back to England and not really fitting in, and difficult, like I say, doing a very manual labouring job, and it was part of the culture, wasn't it, as well? And just seemed how it was. I don't know. We didn't ever think about questioning it. It's just how it is, isn't it? You just accept that this is how things are, even though it wasn't good.
Yeah, I mean, I found it fascinating the other day watching a program, because again, with colliers in my family history, watching a program on how it was normal to visit the pub before work. One of the reasons was to be hydrated, because it was the only way to drink something that wasn't full of bugs that that might make you sick, and you were going to be sweating so much from manual labor. So all these manual laborers who were half cut first thing in the morning and trying to hydrate with ale. So fascinating.
Yeah, it was a rougher old world. A lot of people died of drink that I knew. Labourers and whatever. It wasn't that uncommon, actually.
I mean, it must have been hard labour. Must have been something you saw on a daily basis around you.
Yes, I suppose I did. That's true. Yeah.
Physical work. Were you? What was it like for you? Did you participate as a child in local labouring, farming?
Not really. I mean, it was still very sort of gender segregated. So it was the boys and the men who did that kind of work, and women had to keep home and do the domestic chores. That was my job, which I absolutely hated.
I was about to say, I bet you hated it from what you said about wanting to be in
life, as my husband will attest.
Yeah, you wanted to be in the office as
cleaning chemicals, but
I can already imagine your disposition. I imagine you thinking, I want to drive the tractor. I want to be out there.
Absolutely, you've got it in one. I loved the tractor, but I wasn't. I just sat on it and pretended. I loved the tractor.
what a lovely memory. It's a shame that was so restricted for you. So, by the way, where did your mother and father meet? Do you know? What's their story?
In Kenya. They met in this dim and distant past that they didn't talk about a lot. So, their past was kind of cut off from us as well, because we couldn't imagine the worlds that they'd come from. And they didn't really talk about it a lot, except when their friends came round who'd shared that background. But you couldn't identify with it because these were just strange words. And they spoke Swahili all the time. So especially when I didn't want, you do understand what they were saying. So that was, they spoke Swahili most of the time. So we didn't understand what they were saying.
And so where would they have both been to learn Swahili?
Kenya. That's where they both were born and grew up, because their parents and grandparents had lived there.
Gosh, what a cultural change from Kenya to Somerset, and speaking Swahili.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, that must have been, was that quite exotic for you as a child, or was it just normal? You grew up with your parents speaking Swahili in Somerset.
Switch language when they want to exclude you from the conversation.
Right. Did they teach you any Swahili?
Oh, the odd word.
So you didn't become bilingual and take a GCE in Swahili?
Oh, sadly, no.
Brilliant. Well, thank you. So any relatives that also stood out for you because of, particular qualities or just things that were happening to them in life when you were growing up?
Good question. I had other step grandparents who lived on the Isle of Man. So we went there once, twice. That was lovely going across. Well, it wasn't lovely going on the ferry because we're usually sick. But it was lovely being on the Isle of Man. That was a fascinating place. And seeing the TT races, I loved that as well.
I was about to say, because I've been to the TT a few times.
Have you? Isn't it fantastic? Yeah. The smell and the sound and the speed of it.
There is nothing like it in the world.
No, it's absolutely incredible.
Yeah, to get that close, to sit by the side of the road and a motorbike going past.
It's scary, doesn't it? As a child, it felt really scary.
Yeah, I only went as an adult, and I sat along Cronky Voddy, recorded a motorcyclist go past, probably 6 inches from my face at 200 miles an hour, and all these middle-aged men, we got fit the giggles. It was just... That was one of the most amazing memories of my life, with all these 20 people just giggling and giggling with the joy of this surreal experience. You just think, how is this legal?
I've forgotten about that, but it was a really amazing experience.
And you went there as a child. See, my wife went.
Yeah, they lived in Ballaugh, and Ballaugh Bridge is very...
Oh yeah, Ballaugh Bridge. The jump where the bikers get.
And going in a corner, isn't it? So I was terrified they were going to fall off.
Oh,
absolutely terrified.
So you got to go and be there during the TT.
Yeah.
In families' homes on the racecourse. That's
near enough to walk. Yeah, just to wander down and see it.
Fantastic. Yeah. In the biking world, that's like you're like royalty who's got prime real estate location to get close to the racing. Yeah, it's a strange place, isn't it? And yes, the ferry. I remember the ferry very well on a rainy day.
Yes.
Yeah.
Isle of Man steam packet.
Yes. So any other relatives, any experiences that come to mind for you growing up that you knew?
We didn't see the relatives that much, when you live in the middle of the countryside, you don't see anyone very much. It's very, very you just live on your own, really. You see people infrequently. So I had quite a lonely childhood in that way.
I mean, were there any relatives nearby that you knew of but didn't see, or were they all spread around?
They were all spread around, yes. But only my grandparents nearby.
Yeah, great. So, talk a little bit more about Somerset. So, Glastonbury, Hot Fuzz, the film. But from doing research today, it sounds like your childhood was quite, if I don't want to overlay words on you, but deprived of opportunity. Was there a lot?
I think so, probably. Have you ever done the Enneagram?
Yes.
I love the Enneagram.
Oh, great.
When I first did it, I was so obviously a 7. What I like about Enneagram is it's so sort of, you're driven by what you're trying to avoid. It's so realistic, isn't it? It's not idealizing. It's about what are you running away from. And 7s are running away from scarcity. They just want to have more and more stuff because they've had some deprivation. So you'll probably put your finger on it there. So.
So you're 7s. Where's the party?
Well, I can't experience different things and
Brilliant. No, I love the Enneagram. My wife is training
What are you, Jason?
I'm a 4.
What's a 4?
4. Very dramatic, very moody. And
yes, the drama queen.
Thank you. That's what my wife says. Drama queen. Because my greatest within the Enneagram, the childhood wounds or your shadow side, whichever phrase you use. Mine is, of course, abandonment. Both my parents abandoned me when I was younger. So, that was what.
I see. So you want attention.
Want to take care of people so that they won't leave. That's my childhood wound. I mean, works well being a pastor. It means you get to care really well for people, but it's also the downside, over caring for people, trying to rescue them and other stuff. So.
Oh, how interesting. It is good, isn't it? I still think it's
a very, very helpful tool, especially for spiritual formation.
Yeah. Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, we could get all nerdy on the Enneagram, and then you've got the wings. I wonder whether you're more, if you lean towards the 8 or the 6. Do you know?
Yeah, 8, the power wing.
Yeah. That would fit your CV.
It's the justice warrior.
Yeah.
If I see something unjust, I just want to wade in and
were you always like that?
Kill the bully. I hate bullies.
Kill the bully. Yeah. I mean, how far back have you got any memories? How far back would you go to remember a time when you had that passion? Kill the bully. Yeah.
Always, I think.
Yeah.
Always. I can remember. Actually, that reminds me of something. I can remember at primary school. Which is very rural. There was one girl who we'd now say had special needs, and she was just so out of it. She shouldn't be at that school, of course. It wouldn't be the case these days. She had learning difficulties, and I remember her being sort of ganged up on behind the shed, and people sort of twanging the elastic on her knickers.
Oh gosh!
And I remember, I still feel terrible about that, but I didn't do something about it. I knew it was wrong, as a child, this person being mobbed, and that was a terrible thing. And after that, I decided, never, ever stand by and watch someone doing that to somebody.
Oh, good for you. It's amazing how we become more of who we were when we were kids, which is why this will be fun.
It's changed, it's depressingly. No development at all, you just stay the same.
Yeah. Now, so digging into, again, a little bit of Somerset cultural life, so this rural life, but also sort of alluded to some of you've got Glastonbury there, some of the alternative lifestyles going on down in Somerset. Were your family, traditional and conservative, or were they involved in it?
Oh yeah, no, very.
You're right.
And sort of in the big and the small C.
A big and a small C.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So what did they make of the Glastonbury Festival and all the other?
Nothing. It was just totally outside their
right.
thinking. Yeah. They were suspicious of it, but
yeah.
Want them to know about it.
And what about for you as a young person growing up? Were you cocooned in a conventional world, or was this alternative lifestyles and cultures around you in Somerset? Were they available to you in any way?
They were available, through school friends and bands and your social life to some extent. Then you had to come home.
Now, some people stay in one place when they're children, and other people move as their parents find work. What was that? What was your childhood like?
Staying in one place.
Did you stay in one place? Did you have to move around?
I went to lots of different schools just by sort of they just kept closing. Nothing to do with me.
Really? Oh.
Yes. I went to 2 primary schools because they did move just 10 miles, but that meant different primary schools. And then I went to very old-fashioned convent school, even though we weren't Catholic, for 3 years.
Right.
And then the comprehensive school, and then a sixth form college. So I was always moving schools.
Gosh.
But we didn't move. We only moved house
Yeah.
twice. Only a tiny radius, so didn't move much.
Yeah. And those schools, were they all, it sounds like there were quite some differences between them.
They were incredibly different. I think that's what made me a sociologist, because they were so unbelievably different. And they had a different ethos and different, the people in them were different. And one was intensely old-fashionedly Christian, and one was very secular and progressive. And yeah, so even in this tiny place, you can move between incredibly different worlds.
Yeah, I just wonder if that was a shock for you, because I, great trauma in my life. I moved during primary school from looking back now, quite a progressive, modern, new school, which I quite loved, to this school full of what seemed like very old teachers who all smoked. Everything was in, we had inkwells in the desks. It was so old fashioned, even though it was a state school. And I didn't cope well from going from one environment to the other.
Oh, yeah, we had inkwells in all the schools. Well, just the hole where the inkwell used to be.
Yeah.
Oh, I completely identify with that. It was really hard when you love one and you're secure and you're happy. I loved my first one, and there were 2 teachers only. It was tiny.
2 teachers. Wow.
2 teachers, the senior and the junior class.
Oh my goodness.
2 classrooms and 2 teachers.
Oh.
And it was lovely. And then the second one wasn't as nice. That was a bit scary. It had 3 classes and 3 teachers.
How did you adapt to that change? Did it stretch you in good ways, or was it difficult for you?
I miss my friends, and it was such a small world. It sounds crazy now. Like, we moved maybe 6 miles, 7 miles, and yet it seemed like you just couldn't see your friends. It was too far as a child to go. So that was it. You were just cut off from them, and you had to start all over again.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Hard, isn't it?
I try and tell my kids, try to understand. They're in their late 20s now, that if I wanted a private conversation, having to walk, a mile to the nearest payphone and put coins in it to ring someone for a private conversation.
A mile, that was near.
Yeah, for you it must have been. My wife grew up in the countryside, and again, I get that sense of everything. Until she got a car, it was impossible to get to anywhere without. Everything was just.
That's right. Exactly right. Yeah.
At least I could walk to a corner shop and a payphone. So your educational experience, so when you're growing up as a child, did it encourage you to look beyond your local environment? So I'm getting a picture here of rural Somerset and conservative parents with a big C and a little c, but then they're speaking Swahili, and you've got. But so, what did education do to you for your horizons?
It was everything. It was everything. That was my whole world. That was my big world. That was where I escaped to. So, yeah, I've always had a book. That was my real world. Everything I've been talking to you was a secondary world, really.
Wow. So books were your primary.
The world of the head.
Fantastic. There we can relate and connect. Yeah. I escaped into books.
Same thing.
It was a portal to another world. I used to wish I'd been adopted, and I would, got an adult reader's library pass for the town library that you shouldn't get. I don't know how I managed to persuade them to give it to me, but I did, and I would bring books, and I just read and read and read and read, and it was an escape, but it set me up for the rest of my life. So, but yeah, books. So, what were you reading? Can you remember what's
anything and everything?
Yeah.
From Plato to Enid Blyton.
Fantastic. So the famous 5. Did you read all those all the way through?
All of those. I loved them. Simon PhD interests me on boys' adventure stories, and yes, definitely read all of those.
Yeah, I did the same. Managed to persuade my parents to buy those for me, and I read them all through. And then, of course, for me, the Chronicles of Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and
I never read that. We never had that.
Yeah, so lots of reading. I used to go to the library and just wander around and pick a book from any section and take it home and read it. Engineering, architecture, anything. Was just love to escape. Was desperate to escape where I was, and books were the way for me. So for you, was it just like, were you looking for escape? Was it just interest? You said it was your real world. The other world wasn't. That was the secondary thing. What were you aware of when you were with all this reading?
Oh, just the world, isn't it? I mean, because like you say, you can read about architecture, you can read about Japan, you can read about. It's just a portal onto any world you want to enter. And at that age, I just wanted to enter every single world. There's the 7. I wanted to know everything. I thought I could be or do absolutely anything just by reading about it. So
your careers advisor, if you had one, must have had a hard time knowing what you wanted to. What do you want to be when I grow up? Everything. Was that what you used to think?
Oh, a dental hygienist was what I was told at school by the careers advisor. I knew immediately that was complete bollocks, and that was the last thing in the world I wanted to do. So I never listened to a careers advisor ever again. I was really insulted. Not even a dentist, the dental hygienist. Oh.
Was it quite prescriptive back in the day? They were like, this is what you should be. We have decided. Was it that kind of?
That was it. You should be a dental hygienist. There were no options. That was what was prescribed. So my parents wanted me to be a secretary, and the careers advisor wanted me to be a dental hygienist.
What did you want to be?
They're all completely.
What were your other? What you said it was bollocks, but what did you know what you wanted to be, or did you think, I'm definitely not that?
An academic, obviously. What
you
else?
did from an early age, did you?
Like reading. What else do you want to be? It just struck me. I can read all my life. This is obviously the way to go. I didn't know any academics, so I thought that would be ideal.
Yeah. So you were the first academic in your family, first person to get a degree. I mean, we'll get to university in a minute.
Yeah, first person to do any of those things. Yes.
Yeah. Do you know, one of my first memories at high school, reading like a flow chart of opportunities for life. It's some sort of careers thing. I must have been 11 or 12. And it went through, apprenticeships and everything else. And then I do remember it said degree, and no one in my family had a degree in anything. And then it said your career opportunities. It didn't say anything you want, but that's what I remember. And I remember in that moment thinking, I'm going to get a degree, because it was a doorway. Yeah. Oh, I was 11 or 12, and I think
you decide quite early if you're determined to do something, don't you?
Yeah. So I can sympathise with that. You were like, education was, you knew.
I absolutely knew from the beginning. Education was what I wanted to do. I liked it. It was great. I was good at it.
Brilliant.
I couldn't join the army. I'd found that out.
Like dress code.
Like the dress code.
We're going to be a dental hygienist. Fantastic. So it sounds like school was a positive experience for you mostly. You were able to engage and learn, and.
Yeah, I liked it. I was good at it. It was easy. I've never found it difficult. I didn't struggle with it. It was fine. By sixth form, I was absolutely bored, rigid. I just wanted to leave and get on.
Yeah.
But school was my escape. I liked school. Compared to school was good.
Yeah, a lot of people haven't experienced a sixth form. Was it a separate sixth form college that you went to?
Yes.
Yeah, I did too. How large was it? Was it a large one?
Yeah, I think it was quite large. I can't tell you the numbers, but
they generally are, aren't they? I'm just thinking of, so you've gone from to a school with 2 teachers to you end up at a sixth form college. That's quite a progression in comprehensive education in the UK, isn't it?
Yeah, the sixth form was new too. It was all new. They were all new experiments, weren't they? The comprehensive school and that, and it was. Yeah, it was. You meant to have. You had a bit more independence. You could go out at lunchtime.
Yeah.
Hang out in the high street. Make trouble.
Very exciting. My sixth form college was huge, about 2,000 people. It's huge campus, and yeah, it was quite exciting actually to escape from high school to a sixth form college. So can I ask you a little bit here about your experience of church growing up? What part did religion play in your family and for you?
It was just part of the background in the villages where I grew up, and the schools were Church of England primary schools. So it was just part of the fabric of life. My parents weren't religious, I wouldn't say, but they weren't atheists, and they went Christmas and Easter. We went for school, and they had a lot of the vicar came in, and so it was just taken for granted, really. Rural, Anglican, very nice. Like you, I found it very warm, welcoming. The teachers, it was mainly transmitted by the women teachers, and it was a very gentle, lovely version of Christianity, really. It was about being who you are. It's about being called to something. It was about being kind and loving and grateful for things. And it seemed a very nice vision of the world. And it was very rural, very pagan, the ceremonies. It was all about dragging lots of greenery into church at Easter and Christmas and lighting candles. We never read the Bible or any weird evangelical practices,
So you never read the Bible?
Horrified by when I met them at university. I just couldn't believe it.
Who are these Christians that read the Bible?
Yes.
So what was so I got a childhood memory of so I never went to church till I was 17, but I do remember harvest festivals at school that the local vicar would come in to take, and we would have to take our produce in for this. And of course, for me, growing up in surrounded by concrete, I just never really got, I knew seasons, but I guess harvest time for you must have been huge in the life of.
It was huge. I mean, it made perfect sense. I understand ritual because it completely fitted that community. So you beat the bounds of the parish. You had Rogation Sunday. You had
the bounds. Now that's a phrase I've heard, but I don't know what it is. What's beating the bounds?
You walk round the boundaries of the parish.
That doesn't sound as exciting as I thought. It was like
Morris dancing
with sticks. You don't hit things.
There are certain stones marking, and you have to. There is some beating that goes on, but not of people.
Right. So you wander around the boundaries. Yeah.
It's like a dog marking its territory.
Beating the bounds.
Beating the boundaries.
Fantastic. So you were doing, all these rituals.
Like religion, that's the important point, which is sort of all good religion. It's not right religion. It's what you do. It's just part of life, and it was just part of life.
Yeah, we will get on to talking about your education and work, and then what is religion, and everybody has rituals for.
So my religion was very, I would now say, I didn't think at the time, very pagan. It was about wandering about in nature. It was about those very rural festivals. It was rural, Anglican, enculturated.
Pagan.
Pagan. Almost gone now, sadly. Well, no, not completely, but
yeah.
There's been quite an attempt to sort of root it out, I think, sadly.
Yeah. Well, thank you. So let's get on to secondary education. I touched on sixth form, but moving from primary into secondary, was this the convent school here, or was that a primary school that you went to?
Well, I went there for a little bit, and then I went to a comprehensive school. They were both my secondary schools.
Yeah. And what size was your high school that you went to, secondary school?
The comprehensive school.
Yeah.
That was big. I mean, it seemed huge to me because the convent school was quite tiny.
Yeah.
Yeah. So big.
But tell me this, getting to know you a little bit, Linda. So Enneagram 7 at a young age, wanting to take everything. How on earth did you land on your options for your GCEs? Did you try and do everything? Were you one of those people that did everything, or did you agonize over your choices?
I did as many as I could. I only did 10. I think there was a limit, but I wanted to try everything. I thought I was going to be a scientist at that time. You're completely right. I couldn't decide.
Fantastic. So were you forceful? You were like, why do I have to choose between geography and history? I want to do both.
I don't remember being forceful. I don't remember being forceful.
I don't know if you were. How are you?
No, I was quite shy.
A little bit of a cheeky question then. Do you any subjects you remember that you didn't take that you were happy not to do? Were there any that you were quite willing not to take forward?
No, I like them all. I just wanted to do more and more of them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Brilliant. I love it. So we touched on, so thinking about university. So what for you wanting, discover, you talked about progressing in education and knowing that you wanted to do that. When did that become consciously expressed by you with your parents, people at school? How did that come to life?
Oh, so I don't know. I don't think I didn't consciously express it. I kept it secret, I think, because it would have been so difficult to I know my parents didn't want me to leave or go to university, and my schools weren't really particularly geared up for that. So it was a sort of secret ambition that I just beavered away at quietly.
Yeah. So secret ambition, beavered away. Obviously, you got to go to university. Did you just surprise your parents? Haha, surprise! I'm off. Or
No, I said I'm going to apply for university.
Yeah. How did that go?
Well, they didn't fight that particularly. What they thought was me studying. You know, they hated me sitting in my room studying. They thought it was bad for me. So they would say, "Get some fresh air. You know, to come out now. You've been in there long enough." You know, that's what I had to hide.
Yeah, brilliant.
Hide from. So they didn't actually oppose me going, but they just didn't really want me to do what was necessary to get there, I suppose.
Great. So they didn't oppose you, but you said you were keeping it a little bit secret, and your school wasn't set up for it. So how on earth did you end up going off to university? How did you make it?
I just worked really hard. I just studied all the time, and actually, my schools weren't very good at all. But my sixth form wasn't bad. So my A level, I had a good RE A level teacher. He was very good.
Was he?
Remember
his name?
I just read everything.
You remember his name, this RE teacher?
John Tyler, yes.
John Tyler. And did he encourage you for anyone at sixth form there who was encouraging you?
He encouraged me to go to Cambridge because he'd been to Cambridge. So that was why I went to Cambridge.
Brilliant. Yeah, it's interesting in these interviews, different mentor, people, important people in education who say, you'd be really good at this, you should go there, or
Yes, I know, it's very important. I always say that to my students, because you just need somebody, don't you, to encourage you. Yeah. It can just be a word, it's not much.
Yeah it can be. So brilliant. So you got some encouragement there. Went through the whole application process. Was so at this point, so you're going off to Cambridge. So and what was that process? How did you get through the selection process for Cambridge? What do you remember about that?
It wasn't very difficult. It was it was just A-level based by that time. It just changed. So I just went up for interview, just like people do today, and got a conditional offer, conditional on getting the grades at A-level, and that was it.
And you did, and never any doubts in your mind about going there?
Well, I wanted to. I doubted whether I'd be able to, but I definitely wanted to, for sure.
I mean, other than knowing about Cambridge and seeing it on the television, did you get to visit it many times before you went there to study, or was it literally just for your interview? Was that the?
I've been once before. I went once before, and I had a friend of one of my school friends' brothers was there, so I went there about a year before I applied and thought, it's great. I love it. What people forget is that how old are you? Do you mind me asking?
I'm 52.
So for our generation, we're about the same generation. I'm a bit older, but Generation X.
Yeah, Gen X.
5% of people went to university. 5%. It's now getting on for 50%.
I know.
So it was a completely different game, wasn't it? And it was something very strange that most people didn't do.
Yeah.
And therefore very, very exciting, because it was just very strange and different.
Magical.
So,
So this other world, because Cambridge must be, for anybody. I mean, unless you've grown up there, to turn up there and walk around it must be.
I loved it. I could not have been happier. People say they have imposter syndrome, and especially when they don't come from that sort of background. I never thought that. I thought, I absolutely deserve to be here. This is where I should be.
Now that's interesting, because as you know, I've interviewed Anna Rowlands, Professor of Catholic Social Thought and Practice at Durham. She was one of my PhD supervisors, and she was telling us about moving from a comprehensive school in Stockport to Cambridge, and she found it such a huge cultural shift that she said she would have left if only for her parents putting their foot down and saying that they refused to let her leave. But yours is the opposite. I love it. I was made for this. I deserve to be here. Yeah.
What I liked was the culture shift. I wanted to get out of that culture. I was desperate for a bigger, wider culture. So the fact it was utterly incomprehensible I found that so exciting. I remember going to my first seminar and I literally didn't understand a single word that anybody said. It was about Karl Barth.
Right, yeah.
I thought, this is fantastic. It's like learning a new language. It was going to open up if it had been what I was used to, I'd have been bored. So it was the fact that it was so different, and I didn't understand anything about these public school kids and what they were talking about and it was all so weird that it was like going to Disneyland. It was wonderful.
So it's just all a huge adventure for you.
A huge adventure, yes.
A playground for an Enneagram 7.
Exactly.
So everything from the strange in phrases, the dress codes,
all great. All loved it.
You just lapped it all up.
And the privilege is unbelievable. Coming from what I came to somewhere where they made your beds on a Friday.
Made your beds?
Cooked your meals. You got your bed made. Can you imagine? It was absolute paradise.
Yeah. Can't imagine having my bed made.
No homework, no housework.
Wow. Oh my goodness. Brilliant. Oh, and then so let's actually talk about the experience, the educational experience.
Oh, that.
Yeah. All the bit that you were there to do, aside from all the fun and the culture and the relationships and the learning. Any tutors that stood out for you at Cambridge?
Don Cupitt. Have you heard of him?
Yes. Oh gosh, yeah, of course. Yeah. Wow.
He was my tutor. He was my college that's why I went to Emmanuel, which is because he'd been on the telly with the Sea of Faith.
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah, that's the thing he's most well known for, isn't he?
Just when I, it was just when I was there, and he was famous, and so that's why I applied to that college. I wanted to do theology. He was obviously the go-to guy.
Yeah.
And he was a very charismatic figure.
Was he?
Oh yes.
In every regard, charismatic in terms of presentation.
He was just a real intellectual. He was what I expected.
Yeah.
Yeah, he'd just go and get a book off his shelf and tell you about it. And he'd read everything. He could paraphrase anything. He was brilliant. He could talk about anything. He was wonderful. And he reflected on the world we live in, not just something from his bookshelf. He brought the ideas to the world. That's what was lovely about him. He was theorizing what was happening in the society the whole time.
Wasn't he an Anglican priest?
He was the college chaplain.
So he had a bit of grounding in pastoral.
Oh no grounding in pastoral things. No.
Just a chaplain. Okay, so he hadn't done any real priesting.
It was terrible pastorally. It was absolutely terrible.
Fantastic.
And no emotional skills whatsoever.
So that must have been stimulating and exciting. Any other tutors that stood out for you in your time there?
Rowan Williams taught me actually as systematics.
Did he?
Yes. God. But he wasn't charismatic, funnily enough. It was pretty dull stuff.
Yeah.
Bless him.
So it was an Enneagram 7, not knowing you're an Enneagram 7. How did you cope with dullness?
Not well.
Right.
Not well. How do 4s cope with dullness? Not well, I shouldn't think.
Oh no.
No.
I have to retreat inwards and make things interesting myself. If something's dull, I have to find a way to.
Brilliant.
I don't like dullness. Yeah. Wow. So I
take that back. I'm pretty good with dull. I once did I'm an academic. I'm used to dull.
You must have to.
Yeah, you have to be used to dull. I did a media training course.
Yeah.
With I've forgotten her name. She's in this on today. A really great woman. It was an excellent course. Anyway, they showed us part of the training. They showed us there were 3 of us academics being trained to do media work. They showed us 3 presentations about facts and figures, and one was incredibly dull, and the person just talking at you. And then, up to one which was much more stimulating with PowerPoints and whatever. And then they asked you to recall what you could from each of the 3 presentations. Well, we could all recall the first one absolutely perfectly.
Yeah.
And she said, "You've just ruined the whole thing. No one's ever been able to remember anything that man said." And we said, "Well, we're used to dull. We're trained to
academics.
Trained to deal with dull."
Yes. So I do remember on my PhD thinking, if I have to stare any longer at my footnotes and formatting with the intricacies of Chicago.
But you did it. You did it.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, some things are just necessary, aren't they? But
Yeah.
for you, it was the research and the learning, not the.
I'm a bit like you. I could do that. I'm very fussy about my footnotes, but it's not what I enjoy.
Yeah. Yeah. Some people do, don't they? I've met
Yes.
academics who'd actually just enjoy the formatting and the.
Definitely.
Yeah, definitely.
People love doing that. Yeah.
A little too dull for me.
I get those people to help me.
Yes.
I'm both really happy.
Well, you're a 7. You bring everybody in. That's great. So, what was your attitude to faith like when you were at Cambridge? So you've described what your childhood was like. What was?
I was quite pious, I think, because I'd had this Christian upbringing, and I was studying theology.
Yeah. So you went to chapel?
I went to chapel regularly.
Yeah. Were you making connections between what you were doing with your theology and your faith? And
oh yes, all the time. It was absolutely integral. My faith was entirely theological, so it changed with every book I read.
Tell us a bit about that.
I think my faith was always how I navigated the world. It's absolutely essential. It was my compass. It was my everything. So but it was open to change. So everything I read, I was trying to augment it, improve it, develop it. So it was constantly changing. That's why when I encountered an evangelical who took me to an evangelical church, which I'd not been to before in Cambridge, I was absolutely horrified. I was shocked, rigid to the core with everything about it. It was absolute antithesis of what Christianity meant to me, and it really worried me that people thought it could be this. And that they used to pray about Don Cupitt and worry about him and things like that. And I found that absolutely shocking, because my faith is an intellectual faith rather than a propositional kinds of.
Yeah, it's so I came to faith at 17 in an evangelical church, a Baptist church, and did a theology degree, and then later in life did a professional doctorate, then a PhD, and I must admit I do know things are changing in my church world, but the antithesis towards a thinking faith. So I sort of had to read, the childhood me that liked to read and think. I rediscovered that in my 30s onwards.
Did you have to put it aside then to become a Christian?
I had to make my way in the world, so got involved in church planting and very busy having a family, and it's quite easy to just be so busy with church. The way I dealt with it, I'll be honest with you, Linda, I had a nervous breakdown at 30, complete nervous breakdown. So then I went off and did some master's research, and I actually needed theological reflection to rediscover my faith, and that's what brought me the most healing and wholeness and got me through that time. And
your recovery was doing that.
Theology, yeah. I'd shut off part of who I was for 10 years, just being busy as you can be with work and family. And
of course.
And now, actually, that's changed tremendously in my stream of evangelicalism, a real appreciation of theological training and formation, and I love it when I get to spend time with evangelicals and show them how exciting theology can be and how it can resource their faith and open up their faith, and it's lovely.
Wonderful. And people are often very grateful for that, aren't they? They didn't realize that actually you can be a Christian and think other things, and that's liberating.
Yeah, and the most wonderful thing, to think on your faith. So you had this rich theological, reflective. So I suspect I know the answer to this question. So there were the things that you were being told to read, and then you're like, well, I want to read all these other things as well.
Yes, you're quite right, of course. I know, I never stuck to the reading list.
Yeah.
The thing about Cambridge is the teaching's very bad. That's the thing about those top places.
Yeah.
They can get away with being really bad because they know you're going to go and do it yourself. So it's a good education if you like that. And I liked that. I liked being left to just get on with it.
Yes, there was a pattern emerging here for some of these interviews of people that went to Oxford, Cambridge, of teaching wasn't great, but then I read all these other things, and
I mean, I'm still quite
wonderfully tutored.
Yeah, there's no excuse. As someone at a university that takes teaching much more seriously, they should have done better. It wasn't good, but yeah. Anyway, going off and doing your own thing was perfectly well, it's necessary, really.
But for you, self-directed learning, you must have just been.
I was very happy in the library. I was just
a child in a sweet shop.
Child in a sweet shop, exactly. Yeah.
Fantastic. So let's go to after Cambridge. So, so you have done your degree in theology and religious studies, a double first, and then you do a master's in theology.
That's just kind of automatic at Cambridge.
Oh, that's sorry. I should have said that's the automatic thing where they give it to you.
Then I started to do a PhD, but I didn't finish that. I went straight into a job, which was Ripon College, Cuddesdon, which was teaching theology.
Yeah, how did that come about? Were you looking for work? Did someone approach you?
No, it was all kind of networks in those days. You know, I'm probably somebody rang up, I don't know, their friend and said, "Tell me, we need a woman. Tell me a good woman in theology." And they said, "Oh, we know the one." You know, there wasn't even properly. I was just appointed. It was great.
Right, so you got appointed. So were you a rare breed? I mean, joking aside, are you a rare breed, a female theologian?
Yes, very. There were like two of us in the lecture hall, with a big lecture hall at the time. It was a weird experience, that being at Cambridge. It was very odd. I mean, you have to remember, we were only the second year of women in my college, third year, and a lot of colleges were still male. So you're very aware of sort of storming the battlements all the time, and didn't have any women tutors or anything.
Yeah. So how did the rest of your research, your postgraduate research, develop?
I studied Rabindranath Tagore, who is a Bengali. I went to India, and that was great, Calcutta, and lived there for a bit. And I became interested in how spirituality influenced the West. That was the Glastonbury connection, I think. I went back to that end of the turn of the 19th into the 20th century and how it all began, and I was starting to study that. Which I've always been interested in. I've remained interested in that.
Yeah. So if I can just take you back to Ripon, because I've been there.
Have you?
Oh yeah. So in Cuddesdon, quintessentially English little village.
Yeah.
The Anglican church, across from the college, with one of the oldest. I think the entrance to it, I was told, is one of the oldest Anglican church buildings in the UK. It's very old. So there's college life there. Church across the road, rural, just outside Oxford. What was it like for you there teaching? And I immediately want to jump to conclusions. It's like feels a little bit too small in Somerset, for this cosmopolitan Enneagram 7.
Oh, well, I suppose it was quite familiar. I mean, actually, it was big and exciting compared with where I grew up. To you, that seems rural. To me,
so that was huge. It was huge. Okay, because see, I go there and I think, what a tiny little village in the middle of nowhere. But for you, that was huge.
It was near Oxford, wasn't it? And full of commuters, and it wasn't really rural. It was a strange little world. It was like a sort of prep school. It was like a male prep school. It was odd, it was semi-monastic in its. That's how it had been set up in the 19th century, those colleges, to bring the chaps away from the bright lights and form them as priests. And it still had that ethos. You had to eat all your meals in that college, and everyone complained about the food, and it was very sort of infantilizing in a way.
Yeah.
But I was a tutor. That was bizarre, and I was younger than most of the ordinary.
I was going to say, you'd be young to be a tutor. I
was very young to be a tutor, and a woman, and that was, there were letters of complaint about that, and it was all
Really
odd, actually.
Because you were a female, there were complaints.
There were complaints about appointing a woman to the staff.
My goodness.
It was a very strange world.
Things have changed.
Catholic. I mean, it was very anti the ordination of women struggle was going on. So there were some people who were strongly opposed to that and to women, and some who were strongly fighting for it. That was exciting. It felt like a time of change, and things were going to improve and alter, and that part of it was quite exciting.
So yeah, things have changed there considerably.
Yes and no.
College, haven't they? Well, yeah, I don't know as well as you do. I say some of those things that you mentioned seem to have changed. I suspect the undercurrents remain similar.
Yes, I expect so.
So you're teaching doctrine and ethics and tutoring into the 1990s, but then there's this big break in your career or movement, and you go to Lancaster University.
Yes.
Relocating to what you said was that you described as one of the most boring places in the UK. I'm sure it's not. And then off to move away from theology and ethics to sociology of religion.
Yes.
So what happened to make all that take?
I think it's good being immersed in Anglican culture, because I realised that, I had thought of being ordained, but the fact that no one ever suggested it to me made me realise it probably wasn't the right thing.
I need to stop you there, because I was at one point going to ask. So you come from this Anglican background.
Yeah.
You've done theology and ethics.
Yeah.
You're tutoring in a vicar factory of some sort. Use that phrase. And nobody suggested to you, not one person,
that I'd be ordained.
I just assumed that you decided not to pursue invitations into ordination. Oh my goodness.
No. And I realised, they don't want me, and they probably see something.
Yeah.
And they're probably right.
Yeah.
Thank God I didn't, actually.
So this is good. You've dodged 2 bullets. You've dodged being a dental hygienist, and you've dodged being an Anglican priest.
Yes. I would have, my 8 wing, my, fighting for justice wing would have come out, and I'd have killed myself. I'd have been angry all the time if I'd been ordained into the Church of England. So it's really good that I didn't do that.
Brilliant. Yeah. So tell us more. You don't become an Anglican priest. No one invites you. So tell me all the undercurrents and.
What I really wanted to do were just closed to me. It was a bit like the army again. So I couldn't be a priest because they just didn't want me. I didn't fit. I was too uppity woman, I think, really, and too questioning of everything, and it just, my face didn't fit. So I couldn't do that, which was I disappointed. I wanted to, really, but I kind of realised, no, if people don't want you, there's no point doing something. I wanted to be a theologian then, but that was very difficult for a woman at that time. I went to the Society for the Study of Theology and gave a paper, and it was so hostile, the reception. And the mansplaining and the putting you down, and it was really, it's like waves of hostility. And it was so unusual to make your way at that time. And I just thought, again, this is going to be so hard. It's just going to drain me. So that's probably a closed door. So I was just as interested in ordinary people's theology. And sociology was the place where I could indulge that and actually find out what people believe, rather than, I was also I was very uncomfortable with the role. I think it's lucky I wasn't a priest or a theologian, because I didn't really like the role of preaching. I don't like people telling people what to think and what to do. And I felt uncomfortable in that role. And I could have probably been a horrible person who would have started to enjoy it. I probably am. Not saying I'm not a horrible person, but that role wouldn't have been good for me. And so I'm glad I went sideways into a job where you can just talk to people about what they believe and what matters to them, which I love doing.
So what was it like in terms of academic disciplines moving into sociology of religion? Was it, I mean, you're a bit of a magpie, you had an interest in everything.
Yeah,
You're probably like, oh, something else exciting. Or was it like close? Did it feel close to what you were doing? Or was it because it was so different, you just went, yes, I love this, another learning curve?
Yeah, it wasn't so different when I started because I was appointed to teach Christianity. I was tutoring Christianity, lecturing Christianity, because Lancaster is a fantastic department. It had been set up by Ninian Smart, who,
Oh, yeah.
Absolute pioneer. So he, as you know, um, um, said we don't do theology, we do religious studies. We're going to study all religions of the world and not just Christianity. And he set up the Lancaster department as the flagship department that would do just religious studies. So I was appointed as lecturer in Christianity. So I could bring my theology, quite happily, but take a different slant on it. So don't teach it confessionally, but teach it to people who don't know anything about Christianity, which I loved doing. And that's how I started out. And then I was really lucky because it was in a social science faculty and I had brilliant sociologist colleagues, and I just learned from them on the job, really, and wrote things with them and picked up their skills and read around a new area. As you say, I hadn't thought of a magpie theme, but it's really come out, hasn't it? The 7 magpie. So it was very, very exciting being able to, and I felt at home. I suddenly thought, oh my goodness, I've come home. This is where I want to be. I love being a sociologist.
And so very different environment in many ways. So a big-ish university, I presume, when you went there. Department, faculty, interests. Again, it must have been very exciting.
It was really exciting, and you've made me realise. I just felt this is what I want to be doing, and I'd been looking for it, and I'd found it.
Ah, brilliant!
Yeah,
really wonderful. So so in terms of discipline, how different was sociology? Because again, for people listening to understand sociology of religion compared to just theology, and then again, what were methods like for the way that you were having to put theology within this framework of sociology of religion? Were you free to express things as you wanted, or were you having to shoehorn yourself into other methods in the department?
Well, no, you've put it well, because I think sociology was putting theology into a context. So what I always found odd about, when I was studying the Bible in A-level or Augustine with Rowan Williams, they were these disembodied, Paul and Augustine, those disembodied figures. And I want to understand where they're coming from. What are the fights of their day? Who's paying their wages? Why are they doing this? And what's the political situation? And I never got a context for it. And so I always felt incredibly frustrated, but I didn't know why. And sociology was the context. It's about society. It's about power. It's about the bigger picture. So it just put theology into context. So it all just fell into place.
Brilliant. So yeah, sorry if we get a little academic here. So for my PhD, was inspired by Martin Percy's notion of the binocular. So I combined social science, social theory readings with theological accounts to overlay them with each other, to try and look closer at the real world instead. Isn't
it wonderful? It's wonderful to be in those two worlds.
Oh, it's just so exciting,
Totally.
To make sure you're talking about real things.
Exactly. Oh, we're on exactly the same path there. That's exactly what I suddenly thought. Oh, this is what I've been missing. It was also ethereal. And I love the theology because I love thinking about God, but now I can cash out in terms of who's it serving, who's interested it serve, who's being excluded, whose voices are, it all just fitted together. And being a magpie, having 2 fields that you've got to be expert in was wonderful, both religion and society.
Fantastic. So I'm just trying to picture you in those early moments, lecturing, being a better lecturer than the lecturing you'd received.
Right.
What do you have any memories of those? Those first few lectures where did you enjoy them? Did you think, oh, I love teaching this? Was it the interactions with the students, the conversations? What do you recall?
It was really hard work because I wanted to do a really good job, like you say, and not like I was taught. I was very propelled by not being like the way it was at Cambridge and being better. And I was living with a friend in Blackburn, lodging with him, and in the middle of, and it was actually incredibly Muslim part of Blackburn where we were. I say that because I was working till about 2 o'clock in the morning writing my lectures, but you could go out and get a curry from the takeaway. It was fantastic. We used to love going out. It's so exciting getting a curry at 3 o'clock in the morning, finishing your lectures. So I just worked very hard on the teaching.
Did your students know that your lectures were partly fueled by 3 a.m. curries?
No. I pretended.
Fantastic, brilliant. If I can lean back into your church experience at this point up in Lancaster, what role did practiced organised religion play in your life at this point that was helpful or unhelpful?
At the Lancaster stage?
Yeah, by the time you get to Lancaster.
I wasn't going to church much. I couldn't find a church I liked. I'd gone off church a lot. I was just still, I was back to where I was always, really. I suppose just living it in my life and in my thought and through my work, and not being part of I've never been part of a really tight-knit Christian community ever. That's never been part of my Christianity.
Is there a cathedral in Lancaster?
There is sort of. It's a priory. It's a very large, big medieval building, like a cathedral.
Did you ever make it there?
Yes.
Did that scratch any high church, childhood, pagan, Anglican?
No, not really.
No.
Not really.
Brilliant. So if we can move on now to your long-term interests.
One answer to that, I think, is, traditional Anglicanism, like I knew it, was never about going to church on a Sunday. It was about the occasional rituals. Yeah,
right.
And so I've never liked going to church. I don't particularly like going to church on a Sunday. I never particularly enjoyed that. A sermon usually I just want to argue with. It's very wordy.
Yeah.
It's the same thing every week. It just, worship like that never worked for me. It's not part of my experience.
Sorry, there's a whole aside here we could have on ecclesiology and how you unpack that with your students on what Christianity is. Is it just things you believe? What is it that you do? How did you compare and contrast Christianity in its multiplicities with your own practice?
I worked out through trial and error that there were 3 sorts of Christianity. This is what I argue in my little introductions to Christianity. There are actually 3 main types of Christianity historically. One is church-based, Catholic with a small c Christianity, which it's got very big open boundaries, and it tries to bring in everyone as much as possible and take the whole of society in with it. One is biblical or sectarian, which has got closed boundaries and a clear text and wants to say we're the us against the world. And one is the mystical type, much more about individual influence and experience. And those 3 types have been there from the start, and they weave together and they fight and they diverge and they come together, and they sometimes one grows and one. So Christianity isn't one thing at all. That's how I managed to simplify down my thinking to teach it.
It's one of those strange things, every time I hear somebody, especially disparaging Christianity, I go, which Christianity are you talking about? I mean, never mind academically writing. And then when it comes to evangelicalism, which is my hinterland, you go, which kind of evangelicalism? There are so many different kinds and types. I do like the whole...
So important. It's so important. I think we do our students a real disservice in schools as well by pretending that there is a thing called Christianity. And actually you just give them one version. So at the moment they mainly get an evangelical, what I'd call the biblical sectarian type. And they don't realise that there are other sorts of Christianity. And it's so easy to teach that there are 3 types of Islam or 4 types of Hinduism, or why don't we do it?
Yeah. I mean, I did qualify as an RE teacher back in the day, and I hated teaching RE because the kids didn't want to do it. But I also hated the fact that it was just so compartmentalized from the rest of the curriculum. It's like, to understand any religion, you need to understand sociology, culture. It was just, the distilling every religion down to, a few tenets of belief instead of what religion really is. Frustrated me tremendously.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned a book, just want to highlight it here. So that's in An Introduction to Christianity.
I wrote two. My first big book I wrote was at Lancaster out of this teaching, and it was called An Introduction to Christianity. That's the Cambridge University Press, quite big book. And that was a really full, sort of historical sociology of Christianity from the beginning to the present. And then I later distilled it down into one of those, at the airport, you get those little OUP, very short introductions with a colourful cover. One of those, very short introduction to Christianity, where I distill it all down to 30,000 words.
As you can. Brilliant. That I don't have.
Book ever.
I've got lots of those OUP introductions. I do have The Spiritual Revolution that you wrote with Paul Heelas. Yes, when I started my theological ventures in trying to understand the church and culture, I read that back in the day, and that's some time ago now. You wrote
2005.
2005, yeah. Yeah, that was when I was doing my the professional doctorate that I did on spiritual formation and culture. Right, so oh gosh, too many asides here, too many things to. I start to become a magpie and ask you lots of questions. So yes, your research interests that start to develop out of, you moved to Lancaster. So the growth of spirituality at a time of decline in traditional Christian religion, that becomes your, as I understand it, the main sphere that you start to look at. Yeah. And was that, so obviously you could have ploughed a furrow of teaching Christianity. Was that because of your magpie interest that you took this broader, or was that something that was happening, in this wonderful department that's been set up? Was there this space?
All of the above, really. And I'd always been interested in spirituality from Glastonbury days onwards. It was obviously growing. Everywhere I went, you saw it. And I had this colleague, Paul Heelas, who'd studied the New Age and written a book about the New Age movement. And so we put together a bid and got money to study it seriously in the town of Kendal and do this intensive study of what was going on. And we found, even to our surprise, we found 126 different groups in this little town of 27,000 people. And we realized it's much bigger than anyone thinks. It's just, there was no internet then. So we were studying it 2000, 2002. The internet was just starting, but you couldn't see it. It wasn't easy to find it. We had to nose about for 2 years with 2 researchers to find it, because people did it in their homes, in rented rooms, it wasn't as obvious in those days. So I think that's why that book became famous, because people hadn't realized how significant it was.
Yeah, I do remember how groundbreaking the book was, and everyone telling me I needed to read it. So I do find this fascinating about subcultures.
It was very,
aren't there?
That book was received very badly at the time.
Oh, was it?
Yes, but particularly in church circles.
Okay.
I remember came to Durham to give a seminar on it, and the late Stephen Sykes, who'd been the Bishop of Ely and was a professor there, was there, and he was quite typical. I mean, I got this a lot. People said, "Well, that's not spirituality." And I said, "What do you mean it's not spirituality?" Well, that's not what spirituality is. Spirituality is, it's a Christian thing, and it means this and this and this, and you can't use that word. And this isn't real religion. It's just trivial. It's just nonsense. And they were very hostile to everyone's spiritual activities. You still get a bit of that, but I was remembering that the other day, because it's become so accepted, but there's enormous hostility, because it was mainly women doing these flaky, narcissistic, the critique was absolutely built in. And
yeah. No, I can imagine. So I'm pursuing postgraduate theology education at this point, and various people praying for my soul that theology won't, stop me knowing Jesus, that kind of thing. So that doesn't surprise me. But for me, this book was part of the whole missional emerging church exploration of understanding the church in its wider context. So
right,
yeah, there were a whole lot of us who were reading books like this back in the day, sending them round to each other. So yeah, so it got a good reception in some other spheres. That's good.
Now you were reading it.
Yeah, but I would say this issue of, I mean, how many groups did you say you found?
126.
126. I've discovered a whole other subculture, and I'm surprised they're just everywhere in every niche of life, even before the internet. So my wife and I, typical midlife thing, have discovered narrowboating and canal boats.
Oh, yes.
Just as a different pace of life.
Mm.
But the thing I'm loving is the world of people who live a few steps down away from the road that you don't see, from the builders to the painters to people that supply coal to the pubs along the route. I mean, there is this whole, and then you join some Facebook groups that are now possible. And there is just this whole rich world that's been hidden away. I know. I mean, I used to be into motorcycling a lot. There's a whole subculture there, and we talked about the Isle of Man TT. But it is astonishing how human beings create rich cultures.
Yes.
In the smallest of, give them a space, and we'll create something, won't we?
That's a lovely way of putting it, and that's what sociologists get excited about.
Right.
Finding these subcultures and they're off the radar, aren't they? And they're fascinating, and how do they work, and who's in charge, and who's the alpha here, and but this is what sociologists love nosing about and finding out what are the dynamics here. And
yeah, and
you're a natural sociologist, I think.
Well, different lives that you might have had. You can think all those things. What could I have done when I was young? Maybe sociology and social science. I think I might have found intensely fascinating. My personal research interests. I'm trying to take theology and cognitive science. Those are my postdoctoral interests of just how human beings perceive the world and their habits. It's not much of a leap from habits and practices and worship to how are we formed and how do we think and how do we feel, and mapping those things. So sorry, I just got so many things I could ask you, but I need to keep on track with the questions. So I want to unpack a little the underlying concept that you've described along with sociologists of religion, which is the massive subjective turn of modern culture. Do you remember saying that?
I do remember saying that. We actually were quoting Charles Taylor, a political theorist who noticed this big turn.
Subjective turn.
We thought that was a key to understanding why religion was giving way to spirituality, as we call the subtitle of that book.
Yeah.
That people don't want to just do what they're told anymore or take things on trust, and they want to both make their own choices, but also do so in relation to their own sort of subjective lives. They want to become more emotionally aware. They want things to fit with their own deep feelings and values. And that becomes really primary to them in a way that wasn't the case in the Christian churches on the whole.
Yeah. I mean, part of my research was proposing and suggesting that Christianity itself, especially for evangelicals, if they resource their own tradition, has all these rich resources to attend to those things, but too often the church tries to control them. You can't drink from that. You can't take part in that. I mean, that's for me what I've loved about theology. It's like Professor Andrew Walker, I'm sure you met over the years.
Yes.
He encouraged me to do a PhD way back. I remember sitting in a meeting with him, listening to all these like you talking about things. I'm like, I haven't got a clue what anyone's talking about, but it was fascinating. All these different traditions and backgrounds. And then he leant over to me and he just whispered, he said, these are not just their traditions, they're all yours. And I was like, oh, it was just someone gave you permission to just open up books and go, I don't have to be in this little furrow. There's just, I mean, that for Christianity, that just one comment from one person changed my.
Yes, he's a great man. I love Andrew.
He was great. Oh, how on earth did you, again with this theme of you being a magpie, how on earth did you focus yourself down? I mean, you've got some focus there with Charles Taylor and this subjective turn, but how did you discipline yourself with the people that the amount of data and information, stories that you must have had? How did you personally, with all your interests, how do you find focus when you're doing research?
I always want to sort of sift it out and find out what's the center of gravity of this. You know, what's the heart of it, and how can I tell that story really simply? And how do you get to see the wood from the trees and make sense of all the white noise? That's what I'm always trying to find. What's the golden thread here? What's the really interesting, obvious thing that I can't see? It's really, really hard to find it.
It must be, and I presume you're trying to find things in a way that those people that you've encountered, if they looked at it, they would go, yes, that's us. Is that one of the things you're doing? You want it, it's something they've got to recognise.
They've got to recognise it. I think in every really great book that you read, they're always really easy to read because they're really clear. You're not trying to be intelligent, not trying to dazzle you. They're just lucid and limpid because they can see things clearly. You know, it's very hard for us to see things clearly. Human beings aren't built to understand stuff. We're built to survive and be practical. And understanding things and seeing them clearly, aside from our own interests in them, is really hard work.
So could you, again, so that we can understand the life of a sociologist better, how to get to there, what does it take in terms of research methods that you adhere to and use? What's intuitive? What is just detective work and hard work? What, you know, where are you blending methods? What's it like to get there?
Yeah, every facts are very expensive. You know, a fact takes months and years and a lot of money usually to get to. So you're really sure of something. You've got to do the interviews, the questionnaires, the focus groups, the surveys. You've got to get the questions right. You've got to make sure you're not biasing anything. You've got to make sure you're doing it ethically. You've got to sort of triangulate using different methods to make sure you get the same results. You know, then test it out, give proto papers to people, get them to criticize it, and work at it until you think, yeah, I'm pretty confident that that's right, it's fair, it's honest, it represents the thing right, and you've got something that is good insight into it.
So a lot of time.
A lot of time. It's a real privilege to have the time to do that. Because most people could do it, but they just haven't got the time to do it.
I mean, and so in 2005, I mean, you said a lot of time and money. So you had funding from is it Leverhulme Trust?
Yes.
Did you set that up, or was that a trust?
We applied for that. So that's a big trust. I think it's isn't that soap, Leverhulme?
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's where it comes from. It's a big bequest, you know. So you apply with a project and they fund them.
I mean, and did you walk into this, you know, I mean, Kendal's in Cumbria, isn't it?
Yes.
So you walk in there knowing something you wanted to find out. How did you choose it? What were your assumptions, however provisional, that you held when you went there?
What we did was we thought we decided that we'd use it as our testing ground because there were several competing hypotheses about what's happening to religion in Britain at the time. So one said, Steve Bruce and people said it's all declining, all about to die out. Grace Davey said, no, there's still a lot of religion going on, but it's vicarious, mostly Christian.
That's the belonging.
Believing without belonging.
Believing without belonging.
So people don't go to church, but they still believe a lot of it, and they want the churches to be there doing their things. So two completely incompatible theses. And then some people like Paul and others noticing spirituality and saying, no, this is important. So we thought, well, here are three conflicting hypotheses about exactly the same thing, what's happening to religion in Britain, but any of them got a lot of evidence. Well, they got some, but not enough. Let's take a town, spend a lot of time finding out every single kind of religion and spirituality, and then find what historical research there is on it, and see which of them is true. And
came up with your own. So crudely, what was your critique of Steve Bruce and Grace Davey? Is she still down at Exeter, Grace Davey?
Yeah, she's retired, but she still lives down there.
I'm aware of Steve Bruce, but I haven't really read anything Grace Davies' work. I have had some reading. So, yeah, for those, in a nutshell,
what's the critique? Steve Bruce is pretty right about the decline of the churches, but he's wrong in saying that spirituality is utterly trivial and it shouldn't be taken seriously as a kind of religion. And Grace Davie she's right that people still believe, the majority of people still believe there's something, or some spiritual being, some spiritual entities, but she was wrong about thinking they were framing that in a Christian way any longer.
Brilliant. Thank you so much there. We could carry on packing. So, all right, yeah. Without giving you a mock viva on your research, what are the highlights, the things that you confirmed, and what really surprised you in the research?
Well, we were genuinely surprised how much spirituality there was. The way it confirmed that spirituality was growing incredibly surprised us. We were also astonished to find that 80% of the people involved were women. People never just assumed it was all men because religion was a man's thing. So that was a totally new finding, and we had no way of explaining it. We had to think really hard about why should that be. Those are the things that really surprised us most, I think. The decline of the churches was known. Our research just confirmed what people like Peter Brearley had already found in their surveys.
Yeah, fantastic. Do you know, I could kick myself. I've suddenly realised I sat in a seminar back in 2006. It must have been 2006 because I knew about your book. Someone who lectured at Lancaster University. I think his name was Alan. He was an Anglican priest.
Yes, Alan Billings.
Yes, there we go.
Yes.
Oh gosh, I've just recollected this because I remember it because it stuck with me. The research he presented on how many people have a Christian burial. At the end of life, go to the local Anglican church and won't opt for an atheist, humanist. I mean, that was 15 years ago. He also talked about, again, he must have been a sociologist of some sort, was talking about the number of people that present at local Anglican churches for christenings, like a coming out, celebration of their related married. And yeah, that was some of the research that he was presenting. So, so sorry, is Alan was he a colleague?
Yes, more than that, I was married to Alan for a few years.
Oh my goodness!
he was a priest. He was an Anglican priest, and he did a bit part-time teaching at Lancaster.
Yeah,
he wrote very good popular books.
Yeah, gosh, there you go.
At this time, so that's why we were thinking about these things and talking about these.
So yeah, so
the connection.
Yeah, so summer 2006, I was at some research things I was staying at Christchurch in Oxford, and Alan. It was on Christianity culture. I mean, I was at that point where I was, just consuming all this stuff, and his research was absolutely fascinating on what people are actually doing. Gosh, as it is a small world, isn't it? Yes. Do you know him?
Yes, I do.
Brilliant. So I just wish there was more time to unpack the findings of the research, but just want to focus in at this point on one particular angle. And we want to explore it and then also come back to it a bit later. You discovered what the book calls a gender puzzle. 80%. Don't worry.
Sorry. I open the door.
Yeah, go for it. Do you need to? No problem.
Yep. So
you discovered what the book calls a gender puzzle. And again, you can correct me if I've got this wrong. 80% of those active in what you termed the holistic milieu of Kendal were female. 78% of the groups were led or facilitated by women. You found that this differed from the 50-50 gender split of those who placed moral authority in themselves rather than external agents. Oh gosh, got a little bit dry there, didn't I? But so with all those numbers and gender differentiation. So yeah, what was going on there that you discovered, this gender puzzle?
The gender puzzle, I mean, I think I'm still puzzling over the gender puzzle. We didn't fully explain it, but we had some hunches about it. I mean, partly the women who were so active, they'd made spirituality, it was a woman-made religion. They a lot of them were refugees from either the NHS or teaching. And they just found, like you, they didn't like the managerialism, they didn't like the targets, they didn't feel they could really help people in those worlds. And so whether they were more focused on the teaching aspect or the healing aspect, they found that they could set up their own businesses and draw on their skills and their experience on their own terms and in a new way and in a more holistic way, and meet the whole person in a way they weren't being able to do in their workplaces. So they had a big part in setting it up. And then I think the women accessed it because they found these people congenial. They were probably more congenial than the male GP or other people they might go to. And they were offering therapies for things that they were cheap, accessible, local. Did a good job.
Oh, wonderful. So again, looking at some of the evidence of where these women came from. So some of them you said were refugees from work environments. Have they also been displaced geographically for other reasons into the Kendal area?
Not necessarily. Some had just grown up, they were just local. Kendal wasn't a particular centre of stuff like Glastonbury or Totnes. It was just we just picked it because it was near Lancaster and it was small enough to study and depth, and so they were mostly just local people doing their own thing.
Yeah. And had this just was this an accumulation of people in this place over time doing this? Did you spot any other undercurrents, that were explaining this development and manifestation?
I think we, and actually Paul and I disagreed about this. I think we touched on abuse as a factor. I thought, Paul didn't, but I was sensing that, and some people were starting to talk about that, and that this was they could talk about it in this context, and they had a lot of healing to do. And it was often women, they got to a certain age, I mean, like you, when they got to a point of breakdown, or when the kids left home, or they just needed to change their lives. They'd had quite a lot of life experience, and they'd got to a turning point, and they needed someone to talk things through with in depth. And for some reason, women needed it more than men, or maybe it was just the world we were looking at that was more open to them. The men were going somewhere else, I don't know. But women were definitely trying to come to terms with issues in their past. And this was a forum in which they could do that. And for some, quite a lot, it had some abusive aspect, I think. I still think that's right, but we didn't talk about that in the book. We couldn't really agree about that. We didn't have enough data and we hadn't pursued it. It was before people were really talking about abuse. It's amazing how recent it is, isn't it? How it's come out now, abuse is a really big factor in a lot of people's lives. And we were noticing that was the undercurrent. You used that word quite rightly. And I think I was picking up on that and I didn't quite know what to do with it.
Mm. So you do this extensive study, and then obviously the book gets traction and lots of people make correlations in their own places, and I presume has spawned a whole bunch of other people doing postgraduate studies in other locations. Has there been a lot of coherence between what you found and other people's studies, and any significant differences that you've come to notice over the last 15 years?
Yeah, it's lovely. I mean, a whole field has developed the study of spirituality now, and it's moved on a lot. It's developing all the time. And of course, spirituality is so fast moving and changing. So there's a lot more paganism now. There was some in Kendal, but paganism has become huge, from Wicca to solitary paganism to various forms of magic practice and heathenism and Astaru, and that's just exploded. And men have become much more involved in the heathenism side of things. And people are studying all of that. And the whole world just matured, really. And so there are books on, it's now taught 3 generations, I suppose, of people who might have been brought up in the world of some kind of spirituality. So it's just much more part of the everyday fabric, I think.
Mm. My research methods and focus were on commodification. So the economic practices that people have, with a little bit of Charles Taylor in there, of the isolated individual who is picking and mixing and choosing what they want. So I looked at it more for Christian practices in that aspect of how people are picking and mixing things to create their identities around what my interest was, their Christian faith. So did you touch on issues of commodification or consumer culture in your research for these spiritualities?
I mean, how the market was absolutely central to allowing it to happen, because these women could, they could borrow a little bit of money, they could set up cheaply in their home, and they could advertise. And so I suppose the marketplace offered them a forum that they couldn't get a foot in the door in traditional religion or the churches. But it was for them, yeah. And then they could sell their, they were making money. They weren't making a lot of money in Kent, I must say, but they were making a living, or just about. Some of them were, and it was partly commodified, especially at the more working class end. This wasn't just middle class. But at the more working class end, selling crystals and various sort of healing potions and spells, and for a very small amount of money, you could get something to help you with a problem.
Yeah, my sort of landing, as I said at the end of my research, was instead of as some people, again, I'm talking inside from Christianity, trying to lament, and as if you can control these, the lids off all this stuff in commodified society and commercial society. Actually what Christians should be focusing on theologically, spiritually, is the richness, these intuitions that people have for creating identity, instead of saying, oh, this is wrong and you shouldn't do this. It's like, well, if you want to, here is this richness here that is available, if the church would stop trying to, reject it or control it, and facilitate stuff.
That's a wonderful finding. That's a wonderful way of approaching it, rather than a very po-faced critical way.
Yeah. No, you shouldn't be doing this. This is bad for you.
Trivial. It's all nonsense.
Yeah, and it's not, because these deep intuitions that people have.
That's exactly right.
For identity, and for me, to get more fundamental. All that. That's, again, I'll just drop a little theological thing. So one of the things that excites me, when I discovered Christology, theological anthropology around it, I think one of the most exciting things as a Christian, practicing Christian, is identity formation in relationship to Jesus, Christologically, what it means to be especially human, for diversity and engagement in the world, and just how that is just lost most of the time in spirituality, Christian spirituality, for a lot of practicing Christians.
I don't think I've ever heard a Christian say that before.
Well, there's a lot of us that are now, so thank you. So we've mentioned That Was the Church That Was. You co-authored with Guardian journalist Adrian Brown in 2016 about the Church of England and its slow decline. And I think you've already mentioned, this book confirmed that decline, didn't it? Is that right?
It did. Yeah, we were trying to explain it, really. That was another puzzle. The book was trying to explain why it really collapsed after the 1980s.
And in a nutshell?
In a nutshell, like all churches, it had to cope with enormous social changes that were very difficult for any church to cope with, like women becoming much more equal, and like multi-faith, multiculturalism. And the Church of England did it particularly badly, because it was very badly led, and its leaders made terrible decisions at every point. That's the nutshell version.
That's the report. So if I make a slight chronological detour, talking about this book, and then we'll come back I want to come to the Westminster Faith Debates of 2012 and onwards, and even though I know the two are connected. So how did you come to write a book about the state of the Church of England? Were you invited to?
No. No one wanted to know about the church. No one wants to know about the Church of England. What could be, as Andrew, my co-author, said, what could be more boring? The church that no one's interested in, and why it's declining.
Yeah.
So we'll have to write it in a way that makes it more interesting. I'm a journalist. I can help you with that.
So whose idea was this book? Was it Andrew's?
We probably just we'd met and become friends, and I think we just thought it's a book that needs to be written. No one's going to like it, but we've got to do it. It's because it's part. We've lived. I mean, Andrew had been the religious correspondent of the Guardian for 20-something years. He'd been there right the way through every Lambeth conference, every big event, whatever. And I'd been at it from a very different angle as part of the church, and part of Cuddeston and theology and a sociologist. So we thought we can bring that together.
Yeah. So, as I understand the book, it's structured around the successive Archbishops of Canterbury, the General Synod, to reflect the life of the Anglican Communion, and there's quite a play in the book about the hierarchy of the C of E, and what relationship and bearing that has on the people in the pews day to day. And I'll just interject here before I get to my question. So Simon, our researcher who prepares the interviews for us, Simon's now in an Anglican church in Sussex, lovely part of the world. And his experience, his PhD's in English literature, but his experience of Anglicans is that they largely ignore bishops and archbishops, and most of the vicars in the parish system day to day are largely unaffected. And they might say about the Archbishop of Canterbury, I rather preferred the last one.
Yes.
And he's been struck by making his way into Anglicanism later in life, of the breadth of belief in the Church of England and its strange jumble of views and rather Byzantine structure. So let me get to my question. So with that anecdote plus how you structured the book, is there a danger of exaggerating the importance of the hierarchy? So, I'll probe there. You said it was about leadership, and that is, leadership is important, isn't it? But what did you discover about the importance and the places where it wasn't as important as maybe the hierarchy thought they were?
You're right, and in a sense that the Church of England is both local and national, and it has to work in both places. And the parish is often very distanced from the national centre. It isn't because it's got a parish priest who has to be trained and licensed and oversight and has enormous power, actually. In a sense, I mean, they don't feel like they have, but they have. So it can't. That's the link. That's the link between the centre and the parish. And it can be a very it can be a wonderful relationship with the clergy, the local clergyman and the layperson, or it can be an absolutely terrible one. And often you get exactly the wrong sort of person imposed upon a parish, with a different sort of churchmanship, a different style, different priorities, and then it's just agony for both parties. So, yeah.
You think there'll be more careful matching, but it sounds like there isn't.
But your question about the hierarchy, it's important because Anglicanism used to just be what most people were. You're just born into it. And you didn't actually go to church very often. When you did, you didn't want to be offended by some religious sermon telling you to believe in Jesus. That was not what you wanted to hear. And you also wanted your archbishop to say sensible things that all decent people would agree on. You didn't want him to say that gay people are sinners and divorced people shouldn't be remarried and all the things that the archbishops have said since the 80s, to put themselves right at odds with where most people are in terms of their values. And they've all done it, and they've really alienated people from the church in doing it, and so they do matter.
Fantastic. It's institutional dynamics and relationships are
they're fascinating, aren't they? Really important. Yeah, and leaders, we like to think they're not important, but sadly they can cause unbelievable damage.
Yeah, and when it comes to institutions, again, my own leanings from my own research is that the issue is not whether you are an institution, it's what kind of institution you're part of, even if it's the institution of one. Institutions are vital for life. It's how they're imagined and how power flows around them, and you can't. Absolutely. And again, I come from a tradition of Christians who were thinking they could just opt out of all institutions, and actually tried to show that they were opting into commodified understandings of institutions. There's no neutral place to stand institutionally. You have to make your way in the world in relationship to other people, private and public. And
that is a very mature insight. I think I've got an anarchist streak. I wish we could do without them, but we can't. And so you might as well try and make them as good as you can and stop them oppressing people.
Yeah, I mean, I often quote when it comes to ecclesiology and institutions for my doctoral students, I'll paraphrase Alistair MacIntyre to them and say, basically Alistair MacIntyre said, institutions are the enemy of good practice. Everyone nods. Hospitals make people sick, when they shouldn't, with superbugs. So the very thing that you set up gets in the way of the thing that it was set up for. And a lot of people can nod to that. But then I'll say, but the other thing MacIntyre went on to say is that without institutions, there is no good practice. So that I try and take the view of the insider critic, which is what I try to do in my research. It's like, no matter how much you might like your institution, you should always take a look at it and go, where are we getting in the way of the very thing we were set up to do?
Yeah, totally right.
Because you can't just opt out. You just, even if you do opt out and start something new, you'll make another institution. But
absolutely right. They are so important. They've become really a focus of my work in a way, institutions, because they are responsible for really all the awful things there are in the world, and we hide behind them and they do terrible things, and we don't look at it enough. We're always finding problems in politicians, or where it isn't. It's in corporations, it's in institutions that are going wrong, and we don't hold them to account. And yet we all belong to them, and we can all try and help more and be responsible for them. And as you say, recall them to what they're meant to be doing. Universities are meant to be educating people. They're not meant to be making money.
I know. We could start on the marketisation of education, and I just watched my two kids get their degrees under the new loan system, and I'm like, what are you doing here? Are you having an education, or are you buying? Great. It's just, I just lament what's going on there. But talking of institutions, I have a disabled special needs daughter, my youngest, and I know well the pernicious nature of an institution that should be set up to protect my daughter, but ended up with me having to take them to court 8 times because of those institutional practices where people are good people in impossible situations with firewalls and lawyers, and some people maliciously practicing, where an institution that should behave well can't because of the way it's been structured and set up, especially to save money. But
but the leader can, because you as the institution, they always put the blame on comms and the lawyer and the insurers. You set your insurance policy, you can change it. Lawyers only give you advice. They never tell you what to do. You're the one who makes a decision. So you can blame all those people as much as you like, and they might be not helping, but ultimately the leaders of that institution have got the power to do something different if they want to.
If they want to, yes. Leaders to effect change and not hide behind the institution.
But that's horrible, and I'm sorry to hear you've been through that. That sounds absolutely grueling.
Yeah, no, it's been my most bruising encounter with an institutional life, where you feel utterly disabled by it and thinking, how do you effect change?
Do you feel anything positive came out of it?
Well, as for my daughter, I certainly learnt the intricacies of how different departments work, laws, the relationship between special needs sociologists, political life, funding, lawyers. Learnt far more. Feel like I become an expert on that and help other parents.
What would your message be to someone who's trying to change an institution that's doing malpractice? What did you learn from it?
Oh, what I learned, things of that scale you can't change. Legal action is the only thing. There are, I've got friends in other local authorities. Some other local authorities are very different, but it's impossible. Even where there is a will by people to effect change, they quickly, the structure where I am is set up so that they're firewalled and they've got no authority and can't take things further.
Too low in the chain.
And often the result is you are going to have to brute force things with a lawyer, because that's what institutions have to ultimately respond to. So I took comfort that I live in a country that has legal frameworks that allow that to take place. But it is, yeah.
In the end, the law was your friend.
Yes, it was the only route for redress, as awful as it was, exhausting as it was financially and everything else. But yes, the whole topic. So institutions, is this again, you've got so many interests. Is this a little sideline for you? Is this a major?
Well, Church of England's an institution.
It's a big institution, yeah.
So I've been studying institutions for a long time.
Yeah.
And their abusive sides, I just keep coming across it, from, like I mentioned, in Kendall to the Church of England, and now the abuse scandal in the Church of England's coming out, and we're seeing it's just as bad as the Catholic Church. It's just been hidden for longer. And so I don't really want to study this. It's incredibly depressing and hard work studying these things. I keep saying, no, I'm not going to study unpleasant things any longer, but you just keep tripping over them, and one day I'll have to...
Well, like the threat of abuse. I mean, just looking at what's coming out in the news, online from people in schools are divulging, how many layers to abuse are there? How many have we got to go through?
I think it's so big and so significant, and has affected so many people, that we'll have to change the whole way we think. I mean, say you're a sociologist, you are not going to be able to think about society and institutions without thinking about the role of violence and abuse within them, and how it furthered some interests and crushed other people, and making that much more central. And a lot of questions we ask about why this, that, and society, you've got to factor in these forms of violence and abuse now. It's a major part of why our society looks like it does. And we've managed to hide ourselves, blot it out, haven't we, for a very long time. And it's going to lead to a really big intellectual revolution, just like psychoanalysis did, or just like Marxism did, or just like feminism did. I think we're on this as well now, starting this. Try and look at it in the eye, face it.
So aside from abuses by institutional life and abuse that takes place within them, what are some of the positives? Where did you see any forces for good and for change? So I've just read a canal boat book by a guy, LTC Rolt is his name, and gets on a canal boat during the Second World War when all the canals are falling to disuse, and writes this beautiful book about the canals and the loss of them, that furnishes an imagination in the United Kingdom, and then sets up an institution, the Inland Waterways Association. And there's an institution that tries to say, come on, to get people to collaborate together around something. I'm enjoying reading the book, but it's also interesting to see that institutions can sometimes effect significant change, can't they?
Of course they can, yes, and state institutions can and have and do still, and some institutions work really well for a while and then go bad and go wrong. I've been in too many of those, I'm afraid. So the church is one which I loved and was very committed to, but which I think behaved very badly, and has sort of expelled me against my wishes in a way. And then universities too, which I'm still very attached to and idealistic about, and I had a wonderful education myself, I'm very grateful for, and Lancaster was great and wonderful. But with the expansion of education and marketisation, as you say, they're in real danger now of forgetting what they're for. So I've had a bad experience of institutions. I love institutions, and then them going wrong, which is depressing. But I totally agree with you. We've got to have them. We've got to find ways to fight back and bring them back into more democratic control.
I mean, I haven't mentioned COVID yet. It pops into my head. Do you see any opportunities in COVID for significant change, culturally, institutionally, for people? Do you think this will actually...
I think it makes people realise the state matters, and the state obviously has had to take charge again. And for all the talk of it all being about private sector, it's been very poor. It's been very poor. It hasn't delivered on test and traced. It hasn't, wherever it's been tried, and it's failed, hasn't it? So, really good embedded public sector matters. Hopefully we'll see that. Similar with caring. I really hope it raises the status of carers and people appreciate their importance more. And I don't just mean NHS workers, they're relatively privileged. I mean, the really underpaid care workers in that sector where we left people to die. Horrific. So I hope those things will change.
Thank you. So, elsewhere, written in a very nuanced way about feminist theology and how feminist attempts to construct new theologies are flawed. You can correct me if I've got this understanding wrong, because of their dependence upon the contentious notion of women's experience and their consequent failure to engage with the traditional resources of theology.
Feminist theology was what I was brought up in. It was alive when I was studying theology. It was what made it all incredibly exciting. And we thought we were doing a revolution and it was all going to be different. And we were going to take women's experience and bring it into theology. And then, it's really disappointing what happened. It's all been sidelined by mainstream theology. So I was a little critical at the time of the idea that there's this thing called women's experience. And we can just point to it because women have different experiences. And of course, the critical race theories kept emphasizing that and so on. But now I really regret that feminist theology wasn't mainstreamed and that women weren't brought into theology more and that their perspectives weren't, with a few noble exceptions, taken as seriously as they should have been. And I think it could have changed the whole way we relate to God, think about God. That's what the revolution was trying to do, and it hasn't happened in the churches. And I'm sorry about that.
Yeah.
I've just written a book of theology, which you don't know about because it hasn't been published.
No. What's
I've
that?
been writing for 20 years.
For 20 years? Oh my goodness.
With a very, now he's very elderly, Catholic monk, ex-Catholic monk, called Peter Harvey. And it was we just wrote to each other our theology, our little reflections on things.
Oh gosh.
So that's where my theology went. And the subtitle is Towards a Post-Abusive Theology, because when we realised we were writing about the ways in which the theology abuses power and the church abused power, and thinking, what does theology look like? I mean, it's not critical, it's entirely constructive. What would theology look like if it really took abuse seriously and tried to not be abusive? Gosh. And that's what the book's about.
When's that coming out?
In the autumn.
In the autumn?
This year, 2021.
20 years in the making.
20 years in the making. It's a very short book too.
Is it?
Theology is really hard to write.
Yeah, gosh, yeah. Distilling that down. Oh, I look forward to that. Sorry, just so many asides.
It's about God. I mean, the reason I'm mentioning it is it's about God. God's the one thing I've always been interested in. Yeah. God's the thing I always want to talk about. Theologians wouldn't talk about God. That's why I got fed up with it. And people want to talk about God. And this book talks about God. And feminists were talking about God. That's what was exciting about it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Irony, isn't it?
It's ironic, isn't it?
Theologians who don't want to talk about God.
Yeah.
He should be the focus of conversations. Too many other questions to ask. Let me move on to, trying to make a connection here between that critique of the focus on women's experience and feminist theology, and maybe giving some force to your critique of the manner in which the hierarchy of the Anglican Church regards women. So let me personalize this. So I realize at this stage of life, I'm very fortunate, having come from an evangelical background, went into it at 17. I remember 17 years of no church life. But my tradition, my sort of Pentecostal charismatic one that I'm in, have been for most of that time, has been egalitarian. And I am surrounded by, I've never known a time where I've not had female leaders, female voices at every level.
Gosh.
And I know that's a whole subculture of Christianity so when I talk to other friends, especially from different Christian streams and lots of American streams where that isn't the case. So I'm always, I suppose the water that I swim in is hearing female voices all the time. So then it's always a shock to me step out of that environment into theological environments where that's not the case with women and women's voices. So turning that back into a question for you. So that critique of feminist theology focus on women's experience and maybe a paucity of how the Anglican Church has regarded women. You think it's in a better place? Let me turn that into a question. Do you think it's in a better place now?
No.
Women and women's voice, right? Oh, there was no hesitation there.
No, that's part of that was the church that it was the ignoring women that was the real nail in the coffin, because women had kept the church going. Women were always the heart of the church at parish level. And then women started getting more educated and getting jobs. And the church just didn't want to know. It didn't want to use their skills. It didn't want to integrate them. It didn't think, what are we going to do now? They're not going to do all the work for us, and it wouldn't include them on equal terms, and still doesn't.
And you still think, is it too late? Too many nails in the coffin? We've now got, the Justin Welby moved fleet of foot for women's bishops in 2014. You think it's all a little too late?
Too tokenistic, because whilst you've still got the Church of England saying, we've got a wing which thinks that women can't be ordained, aren't equal, can't be treated the same, and we respect them and we treat them as equals. And you wouldn't do it if someone said, we think that Black people are not equal, can't be ordained, are secondary. We treat you as equals, you've got to respect that. It's just deeply insulting to women, and most women see that and think, I don't want anything to do an institution that says that we've got to respect that as an equally valid viewpoint. And Justin Welby is absolutely on board with that, because he wants to keep the Anglican communion together. That's his main aim.
It's astonishing, isn't it? I got to interview Eve Paul in these series of interviews, and she's
yes, fantastic woman.
Gosh, that was what an amazing woman.
Amazing, yes.
Gosh, I bet you two in a room. I don't know what her Enneagram number is, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was a 7.
Yes, we get on very well. I think she must be a 7.
Yeah. So, she's a Third Church Estates Commissioner, and she's on record suggesting that this hierarchy of the Church of England and how it treats women and pushes just this cultural pushback against women, and how she contrasts that with her her broad secular management leadership world experiences.
Oh yes,
how utterly different they are. Not that there isn't gender discrimination in the secular world, because there is.
It's nothing like the church, though. Still,
yeah,
you just go to a meeting and you get that feeling that you just don't get in other parts of society now. Still.
Well, can I be very personal, Linda? I won't name any names, but I suspect this would have been different. So my daughter is getting married. Went to see a male priest. He asked her questions with her fiance that I know a female priest would never have asked. He presumed to be able to ask questions about their relationship. I won't say what they are for the recording, but when my daughter rang me upset, I was so cross just as a father. And actually, I got a friend who is a female priest who has undone the damage and been wonderful to my daughter. But you just ask that question, you go, why did you presume you had authority to ask that about someone without relationship or knowing them? And I thought, I wonder if that, again, is that a male thing in structure and hierarchy that you just, I observe my daughter. The question was inappropriate. She'd been significantly abused by a previous partner. And the question that he asked, if it had taken a scintilla of time to find out about my daughter, it may just be him being insensitive. But again, I did wonder, is that this masculinity in hierarchy and institutions that, and I'm sure there are female priests who are very insensitive as well, but in my experience, they have a different sensitivity, and I'm not making gender stereotypes. Does that make any sense?
Yes, absolutely. It's clerical patriarchy is a particular type, isn't it? To be called father, to take that role, that's a very odd identity to inhabit, the father of everyone. What's going on there? You can see how that can easily go wrong, can't you?
Yeah, it must do. So is there anything encouraging for you about the Church of England? You can deliberately hesitate before you say no.
There are wonderful people in it. It's got a fantastic tradition. Tradition counts for a lot. It's got wonderful buildings. I think that, for me, the past and history and tradition weigh incredibly heavily. So if you've got a strong and positive tradition, it will come back to life in some way in the future. I just think the current sort of power structures have to die, and it has to collapse now, and then something will grow. Something will grow from that again, something better.
And is that the sociologist in you, from what you've observed in the realms of life and history? It
is. I think people really underestimate how important the past is, and you can change so little. So you either go with the grain of how it was, or you try and change it and you're crushed, and the past will always come back and bite you if you don't take it seriously.
Yeah. Fantastic. Right, we're on the home straight here, Linda. Thank you. If we can move on to your involvement with political hierarchies and your work with the former Education Secretary Charles Clarke in the Westminster Faith Debates. So, as I said, I think early 2012 onwards. So with cabinet reshuffles, prime ministers wield the sort of power that archbishops might only dream of, if they did dream of it. But Charles Clarke was subject to some. We've had a little bit of a blip in secularisation in the last 25 years, which seems that we have, haven't it? We have a series of prime ministers who have either been practicing Christians or sympathetic to Christianity, and even Boris Johnson making an Easter video this past weekend, which was surprising. What's going on there in your experience with? It's a huge question, isn't it? I guess I'm asking you about politics and public faith and the relationship of our politicians to public faith of all sorts, and I guess in particular Christianity. Yes, it's interesting that parliamentarians are much more explicitly, openly Christian than society is. And David Cameron said we're still a Christian society. If you ask people on polls whether we're still a Christian society, they don't think we are. A majority don't. So, but politicians do. Parliament's still more Christian. There's some very strong, very conservative Christian lobbying in Parliament. There are a few MPs who really push a very hard line, Christian line. But yes, prime ministers have been more willing to talk about their faith. Why should politicians be more Christian than the population? Maybe they went to public school. I think probably is part of the answer. They're more likely to go on to public school. And Parliament itself still got a chaplain and a whole Christian sort of structure. And of course, you've got the bishops. So it is a little, it's funny, it is, you're right. It's more Christian than the rest of the country, for good and for ill. Charles Clarke, who I've worked, isn't. He's never been a believer. But as a politician, he thinks religion is extremely important and that politicians deal with it really badly. And so he's very critical of his colleagues because he thinks they pay lip service to Christianity, but they don't get down to what really matters. So, for example, they don't what we're bothered about. They won't reform the RE curriculum and teaching and the place of faith schools and assemblies. They don't want to touch it. So and the Church of England and all its problems, they don't want to touch it. So they talk about Christianity, but they don't actually do anything to keep our institutions up to date and in shape. Frustrating. So some tokenism, some vestigial cultural upbringings in environs that make them know how to say words that relate to it, but without really understanding the substance of religion. Is that what you? Yes, definitely. I mean, Michael Gove sent a Bible around to every school, didn't he? Did he? That's a nice thing to do. But why not think about how we're teaching RE and what we're doing in assemblies? And why not make that of a better standard like other subjects? Why do you just keep... It hasn't been reformed since 1944. Gosh, yeah. Politics and faith. So what were you trying to achieve with the Westminster Faith Debates then? What were you trying to do with those?
Trying to get discussion about religion more up to date and more informed. So we brought scholars, it's a lovely little format. We had 2 scholars and 2 public figures talking about a current issue. Because politicians often speak as if it's the 1950s, as if it's just the Christian churches, and maybe possibly Islam, but they just don't take account of how religion's changed. And we've got a non-religious majority, and we've got spirituality, and we've got many faiths, and how do things need to change to keep step? So we were trying to help that work along, and now we're really focusing, I still work with Charles, on reform of religion in schools and how it's handled.
Yeah. Oh, brilliant. And how much impact do you think that's made, or do you think that's succeeded in changing anything?
I think Westminster Faith Debates were really successful. We had fantastic attendance, lots of senior politicians and civil servants. I think that helped a lot and make it less taboo to talk about religion. People less frightened of making a mistake or offending someone, all the problems there are talking about it. On the schools reform, I think there's a big consensus for the need for change now, and all the teachers groups and unions and widespread recognition it needs to change. We've just got to get our government to take it seriously enough, and got to get the churches, which are a bit of a block on change as well, to also take it more seriously.
Have you got any hope that things will change?
Yes, Wales has changed. Wales has done it.
Okay, what's going on there?
They've reformed their RE curriculum. They're changing it. It's going to be called Religion, Ethics and Values. It's going to be no right to withdraw. So it just becomes a proper subject like other subjects, taken more seriously, better resourced. It's a great step, and I hope that England can.
Oh, brilliant. Sorry, I'm still being triggered by memories of my PGCE in religious.
Yes, I know.
How awful it was. What a way to treat.
I know why change isn't needed.
Yeah. It was so terrible. Oh, brilliant. Do you know, while we've been talking, Reverend Canon Dr. Alan Billings, 24th of July 2006. I've got all my notes here, and he opened on 3 possibilities of the church: decline, resurgence, or transformation, and then presented all of his research findings. It's the first time I got details of secularisation theory and all that stuff. So, and that's where I first heard about your book. I've just noticed in my notes, that's where it went back to, Alan.
Fantastic. You've got a good filing system.
I do. I'm one of those people.
I love filing systems. I'm very impressed.
Do you? Do you ever I've just discovered a thing called Smart Notes, if we nerd out here, as a filing system for keeping all your notes. But
Smart Notes? Is that an app?
There's all these pieces of software now that will let you, when you take your notes, you can actually make what's called backlinks. So you can link within your own work. So if you click on a topic or a word, it will show you all the other places that you've got that in your notes. It's fantastic. Yeah, but
wow, we'll have to have a filing discussion off camera at some point.
that would be a separate series of
Words of the world unite.
I would say nobody would watch, but there may be thousands of people that would enjoy learning about filings. Probably are the filing system, the little niche subcultures of the world. I'm constantly surprised. You can find, this is a whole other issue sociologically, isn't it? So I'm thinking, I bought a radiator cover. I don't know, and it doesn't come with any fixtures and fittings. And I'm like, I'll just Google it and go on YouTube. There is this whole world of people who have recorded how to do what I need to do. Watch thousands of people, and you're like, this ability to extend connections and create, and a whole bunch of people that enjoy fittings and how you put them on walls.
I love it, and it's so generous to put up a little video, isn't it, to show you how to do it? It's lovely.
The time that people take.
It's an open learning community, which is what the world needs.
I posted I've never done it before, question on Amazon on a fixture thinking, will this work? Wake up to 20 responses from people around the world telling me how to use it. And I thought, what, like you say, your generosity of time for people to tell you how to fix something. So now we're right near the end here. So before our last question, Could you tell me, well, you've talked about the new book that you've got, so that's great to know about. It doesn't have a working title yet. You've got the subtitle, is that right?
Yes, it's called Unknowing God.
Oh, Unknowing God. I'll write that down. Unknowing God. Fantastic. And that's this autumn. That's coming out. Great. Yeah. So this is an observation that will get me to a question. You seem determined to talk about God, or the manner in which people are attempting to connect with the supra-rational in a climate of suspicion towards God. I think use this phrase God talk. Use the term God talk. Yeah.
God change. Yes.
God change. Okay. So, I mean, you've already touched on some of this in the interview, but you've mentioned how, people are saying that's not spirituality. You can't say that. And, theologians don't talk about God. But this, after the death of, I would say the death of secularisation theory, that more than ever people want to talk about the super rational, don't they?
Yes.
Yeah. So what are you trying to do there at the minute with your research and your work? What are you hoping to achieve? Are you trying to make a space where people understand that's normal? Are you trying to make environments in which people know how to do that? What are you trying to do, Linda?
That's a lovely question. It would be nice to make a safer space where people can talk without being ridiculed. I think we're horrible at ridiculing people who want to talk about astrology or God or Christ or whatever it might be, or Muhammad, or and it's a shame. And we don't have any serious, intelligent conversations about it, really, do we? It's very, very hard to talk across religious traditions or between spirituality and religion. There's so much, and between the secular and the spiritual, and so everything clamps down on people ever having conversations about how they connect with something bigger, with higher forces and powers, which for many of us are what keep us going, and yet we're not allowed to talk about it. It's a very uncomfortable situation, isn't it? So perhaps I sense I'm sharing with you a wish that we could talk about those things and help make it safer for people to talk about those things.
I mean, just talking out loud with you, I've realised, maybe because of a theological bent, there probably is that, but also, captive to rationalistic scientific discoveries, to poo-poo people at every level, whether it's vaccinations or astrology or everything else. But I'm finding increasingly that actually psychological is a place to stand with metaphor and descriptions and people's experience of lived realities. So when I'm talking with someone who, let's say it's a canal boater who's selling crystals and astrology, instead of jumping to don't be ridiculous, how could you believe that crystals do anything, to go, what does this represent in your life? What's taking place for me? There is a common place to connect there beyond, do crystals do anything or not? To where you can actually have a shared conversation.
I see what you mean. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, that's one place that I'm finding that in the non-rational and immensely theological space for people to share and talk.
What place does it have in your life?
Yeah.
What place does it have in your life?
I find people's stories fascinating. My wife always says to me, "You can talk to anyone." I mean, I used to be, in a previous life, I was an investment broker. That's a whole other story, and I had to meet hundreds and hundreds of different people and get them to talk and open up, and and even though I was giving financial advice, I realized it was a relationship. People want connection, they want to trust you.
Yes.
They want you to be good at what you do, but actually it was relationship was trumped everything.
Did you find it exhausting, or did you get energized by that?
Absolutely. I'm an introvert, but I found people fascinating, because most people I find, if you ask them questions, have the most amazing stories.
Yes, they do.
And we assume things, don't we, culturally? You meet someone who's white male and think this about them, but until you know their story, I mean, there's all these things that we project on one another, but everyone's got these fascinating backstories.
So true.
And you're doing that all the time. You're finding these stories, aren't you?
and getting paid for it. How lucky am I?
Oh, brilliant. So, last question then. Anything else you're working on? So actually, let me split that. Tell me about the Cadbury lectures. What's going on there?
Values. I've become fascinated in values because you suddenly see them everywhere. You know, every organisation's got a values statement. Every school's got a values and ethos statement and puts the values through the curriculum. In my department, we've just had to think what our values are. But more importantly, I've just done a big study of Generation Z or Z, because we were doing it in America, 18 to 25-year-olds, and they're you know, for them, values are absolutely central to their identity. They're much more reflective about what their values are than my generation. So I've become fascinated in why values have become the new religion. The lectures are called Values of the New Religion, and how, you know, even say pride flag, that's become our symbol. So values have become our symbol as well. You'll see it run outside schools and so on, rather than a national thing or a religious thing. So
zebra crossings turned into.
They did. That's right.
There's one where I live. There's a huge one. Most people actually think it's an NHS thing. They don't realise why my
That's
local.
lovely the way the NHS and Pride they've got fused.
Yeah, they have, haven't they?
Yeah, really fascinating. I'm looking at that actually. One of the things I look at.
Right.
So I think values they've floated free from religion. You know, part of the answer, I'm not going to give the answer because I've got to do the lectures. Part of the reason why values have become so prominent is because they've floated free of religious control, and we're doing them for ourselves, and we're having to think about them a lot more, and they're becoming more significant to us because we've got more choice in the matter, therefore, and more investment in our values. And I think we're using it as a way to navigate a very difficult, complex society now. It helps you, doesn't it? If you know what your values are, you can think, no, I don't want to be part of this, or that's just not, I'm not a fan of that, I'm not going to go down that road. Or young people are using it like that, and I'm very impressed with the way they think through, and they want to work somewhere which is in keeping with their values.
So implicit there is the idea that some of these values are good values. I mean, how do you decide what is a good value and what isn't a good value? Is there what's the commodification of values? I'm just, comparing this with because it sounds like you were saying there are some good values there, but then we've got lots more young people telling us what life is like at school with regards to sexual harassment, predatory behavior in an online environment and world. You know, there's what value is at work there?
They can see that because they've got a value. We couldn't even see the abuse. When I was at school, we couldn't even name it because our values didn't render it visible. But once you say, I value the full development of every individual person, then abuse becomes visible, because trying to demean somebody suddenly becomes unacceptable, and we start to say, no, this isn't right, I'm not going to be treated like that, no, you can't touch me, and no, to that, your daughter to the priest, I'm not going to be spoken to like that. Before they just accepted it because we didn't have a value that made it. We couldn't, unless you've got the value, you can't say why it's wrong, can you?
I mean, again,
so abuse has become, it's our big anti-value, I think, because our value has changed from thinking that every individual's got a right to fully develop.
Is it pseudo religious, or is it a genuine religious construction from
values?
From values, yeah.
It's pseudo-religious because it's just one aspect of religion. So it can't be a religion, really. I mean, it can be very important, but religion's about God, and that's not what values are about. So there'll always be a place for religion, and perhaps it can get back to its core business, because it's made such a bloody mess of talking about values that it's a good job it's lost credibility there. Perhaps it can get back to its real business, which is the supernatural, the sacred, the divine.
Yeah, because I find my day job is a minister of a church that for a long time values is the common currency. That's, you can talk about beliefs. People will say they believe something, but then do something very different. Values is the intersection between real belief and practice and habits and commitments and engagement, and usually, when a value's been crossed, because it's a moment when I always tell the members of my church, so when you cross, that's a good moment to go, something I value is going on here. What is it? What if you can get to the value, you can get to what's really going on.
Can't you? Yes.
Work. So please tell me a little bit more about the Cadbury lectures. Could you tell me a little bit more what you're going to be?
Well, I'm going to be talking about how in any modern society like ours, we live in lots of different institutions at once: the family, the school, the university, the workplace, politics, citizenship, and each one has got a different set of values. And it's very hard because they're often conflicting. And I think that's what makes life very difficult for many of us at the moment, because we keep coming across things that we find really hard. They clash with our values and we don't know how to deal with that. And young people are very acutely aware of that institutions are not living up to what they value. So I'm talking more about that and outing what the different values are in different spheres of life, and where we talk about culture wars often in a really superficial, simplistic way. But what are the real tensions that go right into our own lives and that, like you say, you trip up over and get cross about? And so I'm trying to go deeper into ourselves and our society through that lens of values.
I'm just going to take the opportunity as you're here to ask the questions, if I may. So what generates values and what is able to sustain them?
Just living and telling and talking and gossiping, telling stories about it. And that's what generates values. And that's how we refine them all the time. And we make an ethical decision every minute of our lives. We're exercising that muscle the whole time. Every time you make a decision, apart from what to have for lunch, well, even that might have to, even there you might have to make an ethical decision, mightn't you? So I think we just do it all the time. And so what I love about values is we're all equally expert or equally stupid, if you like. No one can claim any priority. We all work at it all the time. And well, of course, some of us do it better or worse, but you just don't know. Some people are so reflective and thoughtful, and you can just see the values lived with integrity in their lives, can't you? And it doesn't matter how educated they are, what background they've had, makes no difference. You can't predict about.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Linda. We've arrived at the end. So anything else you're working on? I may say it took me about half an hour to scroll through your CV with all the things that you have worked on. It was pretty extensive and wonderful. But so we've got the new book, the Cadbury lectures. Anything else you're working on that we could highlight at the minute?
This is just a glimmer in my eye, but we've been talking about crystals and astrology. I'd love to do more about that. For my student, younger people, astrology and tarot are really big and important.
Are they?
And I'd love to know more about that and see why they're just growing in popularity so much.
Yeah, great. Well, Linda, thank you. It has been an absolute privilege to have you here, and thank you for letting me ask you all these questions and just scratch the surface. And thank you I wish you all the best as a theological, sociological, cultural magpie with all the various interests that you have. So thank you so much for today, and thank you for all that you're doing.
Well, thank you and Simon. I couldn't have more absolutely brilliant expert interviewers and researchers. So it's been a real privilege. I'm really grateful to you.
Thank you, Linda. Bye. We hope you enjoyed that, and we have many other interviews with amazing guests where we listen attentively and respectfully to discover people's backstories through their beliefs and life experiences and find out what shaped them into who they are and inspires what they do. You can catch all those interviews by liking and subscribing to our YouTube channel. You can find audio versions in your podcast platform of choice: Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, Stitcher, etc. Just search Extra ECC. Of course, you can go to extraecc.com and sign up for our newsletter and find all our social media links and more. And by the way, all links are in our show notes below.